No, no, it's okay. No, no. Go ahead. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of the 26th Annual International Humanitarian and Security Conference, sponsored by Webster University. As those of you who were here yesterday know, I am Jubin Godarzi. I'm an associate professor and the deputy head of the International Relations Department at Webster and one of the organizers of this conference. Again, welcome, a warm welcome to you all. It's my pleasure also as to introduce our two keynote speakers this morning. Our first speaker, and I also it's a pleasure for me also as a former consultant and political advisor for UNHCR, who worked with UNHCR from 1996 to 2007. And as 2 years as an assistant for the late High Commissioner, Madame Sadako Ogata. It's my pleasure to introduce Madame Gillian Triggs, who is a UN Assistant Secretary General and the UN Assistant High Commissioner for the Protection of Refugees. She oversees UNHCR's protection operations for refugees, asylum seekers, IDPs, and stateless persons worldwide. She is a dual British and Australian national, and as a public international lawyer, Madame Triggs has held a number of high-level positions upholding human rights, law, and refugee protection, including being president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, the director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London, dean of the Faculty of Law and Charles Professor Emeriti of International Law at the University of Sydney, and Professorial Fellow of the University of Melbourne. Madame Triggs has supported many nonprofit organizations, including most recently as chair of Justice Connect, which connects some 10,000 lawyers to provide pro bono advice to asylum seekers and others needing legal support. She is the author of many books and publications on international law, including two publications, 2 books, International Law, Contemporary Principles and Practice, second edition, published in 2011, and Speaking Up, published in 2018. More recently also, it's noteworthy that earlier this Madame Triggs was awarded the Ruth Gator Ginsburg Medal of Honor in recognition of her work for the rule of law and gender equality. So as I said, it's a great with pleasure and a privilege to introduce Madame Triggs. So Madame Triggs, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and lovely to meet you, albeit remotely, and to know that you worked with Madame Ogata, who of course is one of our most cherished and respected High Commissioners for Refugees in Geneva. I'm in Vienna at the moment for another event for the Asylum Day, but I'm really honored, really delighted to be part of Webster University's conference, the 26th International Humanitarian and Security Conference, that is looking in particular at multilateral cooperation and humanitarian action to protect refugees, migrants, and vulnerable populations during this time of the COVID pandemic. It's an extremely important subject, and I'm really very pleased to be part of it. I'd like, if I may, to share some reflections on the challenges to refugee protection in this time of crisis and of pandemic. It is, of course, a year this year in which we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention, the foundation on which the global refugee protection system is built. The 70th anniversary is, of course, a time for reflection on its successes, but also its challenges for the future. Indeed, during the global pandemic, we've seen unprecedented challenges to the legal normative values of the Refugee Convention. But let me begin at the beginning. In 1951, the founding nations of the Refugee Convention were concerned to protect about 2 million people who remained displaced and without protection 6 years after the Second World War. Today, as we commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Convention, our Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, reported some 26.4 million refugees and 48 million people displaced within their own countries. 1% of the world's population is now forcibly displaced. Over the last 10 years, the number of those forcibly displaced has doubled, reflecting well-known and well-researched root causes: persecution, violence, intercommunal and other conflicts, environmental degradation, poverty, the inability to find livelihoods, inequality, especially for women and girls, discrimination, and natural disasters and climate change. But also, and perhaps even more fundamentally, the inability of the international community to achieve peace and to resolve conflicts. As armed conflicts in Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Myanmar, and the Yemen have continued, we've also witnessed new displacements in the Sahel region of Africa, in Ethiopia, and hostilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan, all displacing tens of thousands, even millions of people in some parts of the world, particularly, of course, from Venezuela and South Sudan. While the current situation in Afghanistan has not so far prompted any large refugee exodus, UNHCR is continuing its appeal to donors to scale up support for millions of Afghan refugees already and long-term hosted in Pakistan and Iran. It's against this background and in a time of pandemic that the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention needs to be examined, to take stock with a clear eye, to look at the challenges to current refugee protection. Today, 149 countries are party to either the 51 Convention or the 67 Protocol, or both, reflecting, and I think it's fair to say this, a global consensus on the humanitarian values of these agreements. The core principle of the Refugee Convention, of course, is that no one may be refooled, may be returned to a place of persecution and violence, a principle that is now customary law and binding on all nations. The 26.4 million registered refugees hosted in countries around the world, of course, are testament to governments that have endorsed the Convention in both word and in deed. Yet over the past year and a half, we've seen the unprecedented impacts of the pandemic on displaced people, exacerbating trends in some states, restricting access to basic rights to asylum, to social and economic rights, and attempting to evade their international obligations. One of the greatest threats to the Convention, and indeed to the international asylum system itself, is that while nearly 90% of people displaced are hosted by poor and developing countries, well-resourced nations continue to deny access to asylum by outsourcing their responsibilities to countries with much more limited resources. Rather than shouldering their responsibility for refugees, they aim to shift them to those countries least able to bear them, risking the externalization of asylum and of refoulement to danger. These developments undermine the international protection regime, a sobering observation in this 70th year of the Convention. But there are many other challenges. Pandemic-related health restrictions have been used to restrict and deny access to territory for asylum seekers. Over the last year, 168 countries have fully or partially closed their borders on health grounds, 64 of them making no exceptions whatsoever for asylum seekers. Refoulement to violence and persecution has been reported in 39 countries, and there is compelling evidence of pushbacks at land and sea frontiers. As we speak, there's incontrovertible evidence of brutal pushbacks globally, but most recently in Europe's borders. The loss of life at sea for people seeking protection is incalculable. Research and rescue capacities have been reduced. Disembarkation of those rescued at sea has been repeatedly denied. Arbitrary detention of asylum seekers is increasingly used as a deterrent. Many political leaders conflate migrants with asylum seekers and refugees for political advantage. Walls and barbed wire fences present the visual image of denial of access to asylum, stimulating xenophobia and hate speech that can in turn prompt attacks on refugee camps and on humanitarian workers. 50% of displaced children are out of school. And the Malala Foundation reports that many girls may never return to school as a result of the pandemic. Many girls now are at risk of child marriage, child labor, and early pregnancies. And some countries attempt to transfer their protection obligations to other, usually poor nations and isolated islands, detaining asylum seekers in poor conditions indefinitely and arbitrarily. Added to these challenges that we've been observing over the last, particularly the last 2 years, opportunities for traditional protection solutions, such as resettlement and voluntary returns, have declined dramatically. This past year, for example, only 23,000 refugees departed for resettlement. This is a 64% decline at a time when 1.4 million refugees are in urgent need of resettlement in safety. We are, however, rather more optimistic about the future because the United States is now committed to 125,000 resettlement places in the coming year, and we hope with European support the numbers can rise for 2021 and particularly for 2022. But in addition to the challenges that we all face in finding resettlement places, we also have a problem in achieving voluntary returns. As you will know, most refugees want to return to their own countries, but with protracted long-term conflicts, which seem irresolvable, voluntary, safe, and dignified returns are close to impossible. This is, of course, particularly the case in Myanmar for the Rohingya, who are now living, 1 million of them, in Bangladesh, and of course for people wanting to return to Syria, where they're hosted in large numbers by neighboring states, in particular 3.7 million in Turkey. And we have, of course, difficulties of returns to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and new conflicts in Ethiopia. These are long-term and they do not seem to be resolvable. Only 250,000 refugees were able to return in safety to their country last year, and that's a declining number. Well, in these circumstances, and for all of the reasons that I've outlined, where we are coming to in our advocacy at the UN Refugee Agency is to ask countries to include and integrate those refugees that are living in a protected environment within a host country. These, in fact, are the most realistic opportunities for protection for the many, many millions who will never, sadly, ever be resettled or able to return to their homes. While we've advocated since the beginning of the pandemic of the threats and erosions to refugee protection, I would, however, like to emphasize some of the good practices that we've seen globally and where solutions can be found. At the height of the pandemic, 111 countries did find pragmatic solutions to ensure their asylum systems are fully or partially operational, particularly using technology. And that's been a great leap forward in the world of refugee protection, because many countries, particularly in Europe, have been willing to use digital technologies to receive documents and to conduct interviews. Other inclusion measures have been that displaced and stateless people have been included from the outset of the pandemic in health facilities, giving them access to vaccines. There have been some remarkable stories. Uganda, which is already a host to 1.4 million refugees, has opened its borders over the past year or so, and including in the last few days, accepting thousands of refugees fleeing violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And perhaps in an exceptional gesture, Colombia has now provided a 10-year temporary protection status to 1.7 million displaced Venezuelans. And there are many other examples. So with those examples and positive stories to tell, I'd like to reflect a little on the question of whether the 51 Refugee Convention is capable of responding to current challenges. I'd suggest that the Convention does have enduring value and that its core principles are more relevant today than ever. The Convention is one of the most supported international treaties in the world, and it does reflect common values of humanitarianism, compassion, and solidarity. The language of the Convention has proved to be flexible to protect refugees in the context of contemporary challenges, from climate change to public health emergencies such as COVID. I suggest that we've seen flexibility in the interpretation, particularly by governments, by judicial and administrative tribunals. The biggest challenge to the Convention is not the way it can be interpreted or its own language and provisions, but of course by the failure of so many states to comply with it in practice or to work together to achieve solutions. But I think we have optimism for the future, because in 2018, the 1951 Refugee Convention was reaffirmed by the international community in the Global Compact on Refugees, committed to by 181 of the world's nations. The Compact on Refugees is, I'd suggest, a breakthrough. It's legally non-binding. It's not a treaty. It's a readily accessible document. It's written in plain English, or I assume could be translated into plain German or plain French, if that's possible. But essentially, the Compact ensures that states have agreed that they will share equitably the responsibility for refugees and for those forcibly displaced. Not only is this an agreement among states at an informal level, but it engages the wider international community in a way that has not been possible under the Refugee Convention itself. It includes civil society, national NGOs and international NGOs, the private sector, commercial groups, parliamentarians across the world, faith groups, scholars, universities, as Webster University shows, and of course local government and city mayors, who were often the first responders. They've all committed to the objectives of the Compact and to support host nations and to share the burden and responsibility for refugees, enabling them to be much more self-sufficient and to access solutions in the countries in which they've found refuge. These are not just abstract thoughts, because after 2018, we had a Global Refugee Forum in December 2019, in which more than 1,600 pledges were made by governments and civil society and other stakeholders to give practical effect to the terms of the Compact itself. And that impact will now be measured by objective evidence and data at the forthcoming high-level officials meeting in Geneva, in which we'll take stock of progress in implementing the pledges. Now, this is relatively unusual in the international environment, and as you will all know, one of the great criticisms of international law, one of the great weaknesses of the refugee system has been the inability to enforce grand visions and gestures. And we hope that with an indicator report that will be issued literally in a few days, will inform the high-level officials meeting, and we'll be able to judge for the first time the extent to which those gestures of 1,600 pledges are actually being met in practice. In other words, our feet will be held to the fire of accountability that we have actually met the promises that have been made. Of course, a situation that many of us are thinking about is the crisis in Afghanistan. And it's an important case in point in understanding the nature of international responsibility sharing. Nearly 700 Afghans have been internally displaced by the conflict this year, with some 3.5 million people in total uprooted throughout the country. Iran and Pakistan together host almost 90% of all Afghan refugees worldwide, and they've been doing so for more than 4 decades. Full implementation of all that the Convention and the international protection system stand for, and in particular increased support internationally and solidarity, is therefore urgently needed to allow continued protection for these 1.4 million registered Afghan refugees in Pakistan and nearly 800,000 in Iran. Both countries also host a large population of unregistered Afghans. Of course, it's important to think not about the current crises, or not only about the current crises, but about the future, the ability of the Refugee Convention to respond to the challenges that we're likely to be seeing in the future. And a priority, and perhaps even the number one priority, will be the impact of climate change and natural disasters on the mass displacement of people as an exacerbating factor, driving them from their lands to seek better pastures, water, and food. Of course, an important question as COP26 meets this last week in Glasgow. When the dark clouds of COVID lift, and with global and equitable access to vaccines they surely must, we will see with some greater clarity how climate change is forcing displacement. The UN Secretary General has warned that the disastrous effects of a changing climate, famine, floods, fires, and extreme heat threaten our very existence. Climate change is a risk multiplier, exacerbating inequalities and community tensions, leading to yet more violence and persecution. Climate change affects people inside their own countries and creates internal displacement before it reaches a level where it displaces people across borders. There may be situations where the refugee criteria of the 1951 Convention or the broader refugee criteria of regional refugee law frameworks will apply. People may have a valid claim for refugee status, for example, where the adverse effects of climate change interact with armed conflict and violence. Well, as we seem to be able less and less to find solutions to conflict, finding solutions remains nonetheless at the core of our work. More than 2/3 of the world's refugees, or 68%, are from only 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Peace and stability in just one of these countries will pave the way for voluntary returns and could significantly decrease global displacement. World leaders need to do much better in safeguarding the world's peace and stability. The prevention of new conflicts must come first. This can end the vicious cycle of violence, suffering, and forced displacement. The Convention is a legal basis for the global protection system, and the Global Compact on Refugees that complements the Convention have proved in practice to be both adaptable to prevent those forcibly displaced from conflict and persecution, the impacts of climate change, and global health emergencies. The challenges of the international community are to ensure that it shares equitably their responsibilities for people who've been displaced, and to focus instead on the much more positive view of the benefits and the riches that refugees and asylum seekers can bring to their host communities if given a chance. So thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to learning more about progress with discussions at this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Triggs, for your very insightful and illuminating keynote address, providing us with an overview and also an assessment and analysis of the overall situation of displacement worldwide. We're very grateful. I know you're very busy, and it's anyway. We wish that you were here with us in the CSCG, the Geneva International Conference Center, which is only a stone's throw away from the UNHCR headquarters. But we hope that there will be another opportunity for us to meet you, and I would like to meet you also. I don't know whether you will have time to remain with us or you have a busy schedule in Vienna, but we are now going to have the second keynote address by Professor Otto Hieronymi, who is the founder of the International Humanitarian Security Conference 26 years ago. Professor Hieronymi was a former head of the International Relations Department from 1995 to 2006, and with no further ado, it's my pleasure to give the floor to him. Thank you, Professor Hieronymi.
I don't know whether our previous speaker can still hear me, but I was very much impressed by her presentation, and I feel greatly honored to follow her presentation. But listening to her speech, I was also reminded of our studies trip to Australia, and how we were received by the then head of DIMA. Australia was always a country that was very active in humanitarian affairs, and there have been many prominent members of the international humanitarian community who originally came from Australia. So thank you, Jubin, to have given me the opportunity to follow her. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not particularly good at reading text because with age, your eyesight doesn't improve, to say the least. But first of all, I would like to thank Webster University for upholding this tradition, and especially I would like to thank Jubin and Oreste for having organized this conference, and I'm grateful to them to have included me in the program. Now, my presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, part 1 deals with key aspects of the current global crisis and their consequences. Part 2 covers the record of multilateral cooperation. I forgot to mention, because you can't see it, the title of my presentation is The Crisis and Revival of Multilateral and Humanitarian Cooperation. So part 2 deals with the record of multilateral cooperation. Part 3 lists some recent signs of revival, and part 4 raises the question, where are we going? Now, the word crisis is one of the most frequently used terms expressing deep concern about a given situation. Well, do you ever stop to think what is the true meaning of this frightening statement? We are in a crisis. A Webster website dictionary gives a useful and concise definition of a crisis. It's a time of intense difficulty or danger. It's a time when a difficult or important decision must be made. And it is the turning point of a disease when an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. So I think the word crisis fits very well our time under all 3 headings. Now, there are, however, important distinctions between different types of crisis. These include the distinction between man-made crisis and natural catastrophes, the differences between local or regional crisis and global worldwide crisis, the clash between political orders and crisis within the same political system, and finally, whether the consequences of the crisis are reversible or not. I will briefly discuss 4 current crises: the pandemic, global warming, the closing of borders, and the contrast between liberal and authoritarian systems. Well, within a period of few weeks, the 2019 coronavirus came to be considered as the greatest global threat to human security and welfare. While the pandemic started in China, it was or should have been known from the start that the virus was going to spread rapidly to the rest of the world. The initial denial of the very existence of the virus by the Chinese political rulers was one of those factors that made it quasi-impossible to stop the pandemic in time. Well, according to independent observers, the World Health Organization also first underestimated the nature of the crisis and the urgency of determined action. To this initial human responsibility has to be added the negligent attitude and response of some other governments and political leaders, despite the scientific evidence of global threats presented by COVID-19. Well, I want to mention two positive and two negative developments. The first and most important positive one has been the combined response of scientists, industry, and health authorities in successfully developing, testing, and producing in record time the vaccine, immunizing people against COVID-19. The second positive development was the determination of the authorities of many countries to adopt a combination of social constraints. Well, the negative developments, negative news are also well known. The most important negative development was the truly unexpected. Political and social movements that have hampered our ability to deal with the pandemic. I'm referring to the often violent anti-vaccine campaigns through social media and street demonstrations based on faulty analysis or outright lies. The leaders of the anti-vaccine movement disregard the health consequences of the fake information. If anything, they are proud of creating and deepening division in society. The existence of global warming and its disastrous consequences have been denied for several decades by many people on the political left and on the political right. Today, however, denial in good faith is less and less possible in view of the mounting evidence that climate change has had and will continue to have on the environment throughout the world. The following questions concerning climate change are not discussed, however, often enough. What will happen if the various anti-global warming measures are adopted and implemented? We always talk about what is happening if they are not. But the question of if they are implemented is also very important. How will people, the economy, companies, large and small communities, human society as a whole, manage the enormous changes required without excessive losses and breakdowns? According to the models and predictions, virtually all aspects and components of modern life will have to undergo drastic modifications, with products and processes being replaced on short notice by untested products and processes. Who will determine the specifications of the new means of transport, of the transformation of housing, of food, clothing, of the choice between climate-compatible and climate-non-compatible technologies, and of what we can call acceptable and not acceptable ways of living. The current threat of a new world energy crisis at a time where there is no real shortage of available resources or appropriate technologies ought to be a warning that the complexity of transition has to be taken very seriously. Now, humanitarian action, and in particular the protection of refugees and of other victims of war and political persecutions, have been among the most important examples of international cooperation, both by governments and non-governmental organizations during the last 100 years. Also, the way refugees and other forced migrants are treated provide a reliable guide for the state of international order and international cooperation. In the last few decades, the humanitarian response has been, by and large, positive. Individual humanitarian workers and the entire humanitarian community did rise to the challenge. Now, international cooperation was and remains the measuring rod of what we call a good international order. Where international cooperation suffers, international order is in crisis. In recent years, international cooperation has undergone a growing strain both among the Western democracies and between the West and the major non-democracies such as Russia and China. These strains have multiple causes and manifestations, such as the revival of nationalism and protectionism and the spreading of anti-liberal, anti-democratic doctrines and policies. Does this mean that there will be a new Cold War? Or has it already started, the new Cold War? Now, despite many ups and downs, the last 100 years have been marked by the growth in the number and size of multilateral international organizations, the principal tools of international cooperation. Now, ever since the 19th century, NGOs have also played an important role as tools of international cooperation. Chapter 1 of the Charter of the United Nations defines the purposes and principles of the organization. According to Article 1.1, the main purpose of the United Nations is to work together to maintain international peace and security. Article 1.3 defines the general objective of cooperation: to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems on economic, social, cultural, or of character, and promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. There is, however, an unfortunate paradox. While with very few exceptions, international organizations are based on what can be called Western liberal principles, the great majority of the members are non-liberal, non-democratic, non-Western countries. These are often explicitly or implicitly opposed to the fundamental values and principles embodied in the UN Charter. This paradox is one of the main factors responsible for the crisis of multilateral cooperation. I can see that I will have to cut quite a bit more than give me 6 more minutes, okay? Well, in April 1918, Woodrow Wilson called for a world safe for democracy. The principal instrument of this was going to be the League of Nations. According to Wilson, a standard concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. No autocratic government could be trusted to keep faith within it or observe its covenants. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. The rise of totalitarianism and outbreak of the Second World War sealed the end of the League. Nevertheless, the victorious powers embarked at the end of the war on an even more ambitious project, which was the UN. Now, the United States has played a defining role in the founding and shaping of the vast majority of international organizations that exist today and that has been a principal architect of the network of international cooperation. This was also true for the Marshall Plan and the European Recovery Program. Few people know that the world's first and most successful organization explicitly dedicated to international humanitarian cooperation was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEC. The creation of the OEC was also one of the factors for creating the Western community and for the Cold War. The USSR was strongly opposed to the OEC, strongly opposed to European reconstruction, strongly opposed to European cooperation. Now, today the question is raised, is the West over? The crisis of the West, it's what's happening. Is democracy out of date? Some people believe so. As a British member of the House of Lords, who wrote a book, How Democracy Ends, I'm going to read one quote and then come to the conclusions. He wrote, "Mature Western democracy is over the hill. Its prime is past. We ought to acknowledge that this, an extremely successful and dynamic form of politics that enjoyed a remarkable 100 years run, is winding down. In places where it has had its greatest success. In many ways, we are right to be frightened. Something terminal could be around the corner. The demise of democracy is not our demise. Its salvation is not our salvation. There are no better alternatives around at present, but that doesn't mean that none are possible." Well, I think the Secretary General of the UN doesn't agree. and I think the Webster community doesn't agree. So I'm coming to my conclusion, and which is the question, is the outlook positive or negative? First, the principal conclusion of my presentation is that there is a very close connection between global crises of various types and the state of multilateral cooperation. This is true for natural and man-made crises, such as global warming or COVID-19, or the impending Afghan humanitarian catastrophe. Second, Western values, in particular democracy, solidarity, human rights, and humanitarian protection and assistance, have been at the birth and progress of organized multilateral cooperation. Even the enemies of democracy and of the West in general admit that they have no valid theoretical or practical alternative. Now, what is the outlook? There is no single answer to that question. So I would like to mention the scenarios that we developed in an in-depth Webster study under the title, Quo Vadis Europe? Where is the Europe and the Western community heading? The scenarios were based on a qualitative method involved the analysis of a large number of so-called descriptors. The method used was bottom-up. There was no overriding assumption about the most likely future. Well, the final aggregation of the detailed analysis yielded the following results. The probability of strengthening or weakening the European integration and Western community in the future, with the probabilities equal to 100, showed the weakening was 49%, the strengthening 51%. Well, this is encouraging, but only by a very small margin. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hieronymi, for your keynote presentation. You basically pulled together many things in terms of what's going on in the world, in terms of different trends, developments, different strands, and how they tie in, how they feed into each other, in terms of pandemic, refugee protection, political trends. As I always tell my students, one needs to look at issues holistically, and also identifying certain key weaknesses internationally in terms of the continued, in spite of the end of the Cold War 30 years ago, the existence of authoritarian, non-democratic, non-liberal regimes, and how those have also contributed to the current situation, and also in terms of what you mentioned about the pandemic and the initial denial of the problem. Of course, unfortunately, in some cases, the policies and positions of performance of some of the democratic countries, at least at the outset of the crisis, was not exemplary either. But overall, we live in a world where everything is relative. So you provided us with a lot of food for thought, and thank you for your contribution. And I think we've gotten to a very good start this morning with the presentations by Madam Triggs and also the founder of this conference, Professor Otto Hieronymi. So I think now we will move directly in. We're running a few minutes late, but it's nothing nothing major. So we will move directly to the session 5. And of course, there's going to be, Madam Triggs also talked about, and Professor Uroni, about the impact of climate change. So we're going to have a very good panel with speakers talking about displacement, climate change. We're going to have one speaker who's going to come in directly via Zoom from the COP26. So if you could please come up, thank you very much. We have Heikki Mattila, Barbara Essig from the IDMC, Dina UNESCO, and joining us from Glasgow, I hope it's on, is Atte Solberg, and from the platform on disaster displacement. Morning. How are you? Good to see you. Thank you for coming.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Heikki Mattila. I'm teaching migration and refugee issues at Webster and also at the School for International Training in Geneva. And it is my pleasure and honor to chair this first session of the day after two very eminent speakers. And it is also my pleasure to note that there is a steadily growing number of people present now, has a little bit grown since the beginning of this morning. Climate change indeed was mentioned in no light terms by both of our speakers, keynote speakers this morning. Mrs. Triggs from UNHCR said that it might even be the main challenge for displacement, the looming challenge. And we have in this session three important experts, reference experts on the matter of climate change and displacement of migration as well. And in the next hour, we will hear three presentations. Two of the speakers are here, and the third one will speak to us from Glasgow, which indeed, and very seriously speaking, is one of the main places on Earth now in order to try and resolve very, very difficult issues. The first speaker of this session is Ms. Barbara Essig from Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva, where she is a responsible person for the policy work. She has started her career as a journalist, serving Austrian press agency as a Brussels correspondent, and then turned into diplomacy and worked in the permanent mission of Austria and European Union, being the migration counselor there. And then obviously she is now continuing with diplomatic issues, being indeed the policy responsible of this IDMC, which is then, she is focusing on organizations' engagement with the United Nations system, international partners, NGOs, and the governmental missions in Geneva. And her title indeed of the talk is Climate Change and Internal Displacement. You have the floor.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks a lot to the whole team of the Webster University for inviting me to be here with you today. I'll just maybe wait for a second for my presentation to come on. Yes, perfect. So I will be talking about internal displacement in a changing climate today. I start by giving you the latest internal displacement figures when it comes to disaster displacement. Then I will talk a little bit on how climate change influences internal displacement. And finally, talk about links between climate change, internal displacement, and conflicts. So this is a map showing you all new internal displacements by conflict and disasters in 2020 by country. I use it because it illustrates three things. First of all, the total scale of internal displacement around the world. IDMC recorded 40.5 million new internal displacements in 2020. This is the equivalent of more than 4 times the Swiss population. The second thing that you can see on this map is the fact that disasters trigger many more displacements than conflict and violence. Disaster displacements are represented by the blue circles, while conflict displacements are represented by the orange circles. As you can see, there are almost 3 times more disaster displacements, or 3/4 of the total, than conflict displacements. There were 30.7 million new disaster displacements in 2020, as opposed to 9.8 displacements that were triggered by conflict and violence. This relationship is slightly different. If you look at long-term and protracted displacement, I will say a bit more about this later on. But for now, there's a third thing that I wanted you to look at, which is the fact that disaster displacement, again, the blue circles, really affect the whole world. It is true that the most important disaster displacement events in 2020 took place in Asia, with almost 5.1 million new displacements in China, mainly triggered by floods, 4.4 million displacements in the Philippines, mainly triggered by storms, and also around 4.4 million displacements in Bangladesh, triggered by storms, mainly Typhoon Amphan, but also by floods. However, as you can also see, the Americas and Europe are equally affected. In the United States, we registered 1.7 million new disaster displacements in 2020, mainly due to wildfires, but also due to Hurricane Laura. And in Europe, it was mainly Croatia that was affected, with 42,000 new disaster displacements triggered by 2 subsequent earthquakes. Now, these are the 2020 numbers, of course, but 2021 has so far confirmed this trend, with flooding triggering more than 500,000 new displacements in Indonesia, but also affecting Central Europe and triggering thousands of displacements there this summer. So, unfortunately, neither the high number of new displacements nor the high proportion of disaster displacements are exceptions. As you can see in this graph, both have been constantly high during the past 10 years. And if you go back all the way to 2008, which is when IDMC started to monitor disaster displacements, you will see that on average 24.5 million people have been displaced by disasters every year. What you can also see on this graph is the fact that last year's disaster displacements were the highest in a decade. Now, with disaster displacement, it is often assumed that displacement only lasts for a few days or weeks before affected people can return to their homes. Unfortunately, this is not always true, as disaster displacement can be long-term or even protracted, as rebuilding homes can be time-consuming and resource-intensive. Sometimes return is also simply not possible, as it would expose affected populations to repeated hazards. IDMC estimates that there were at least 7 million people living in continuous displacement following disasters at the end of 2020. This is, however, very likely a significant underestimate, as long-term numbers, long-term data hardly ever exists because it's hardly ever collected, and our estimates are based on housing destruction alone. Where numbers do exist, they show how long it can take for people to rebuild their lives and their homes. In May 2020, Cyclone Amphan triggered 2.5 million new displacements in Bangladesh. The storm destroyed homes, roads, and other infrastructures, and aggravated slow onset hazards such as river erosion. A year after the disaster, almost 300,000 people remained displaced. Another common myth frequently appearing in media headlines in recent years is that disaster displacement and climate change will lead to mass migration across borders and from countries of the global south to the global north. However, there is so far no evidence to support this claim. On the contrary, the overwhelming majority of people displaced by disasters migrate within the borders of their countries. If they do cross borders, it is usually to seek protection in neighboring countries. This fear of a potential large-scale influx of people displaced by disasters is frequently associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So how does climate change influence disaster displacement, and how will climate change affect future numbers when it comes to the people displaced? This infographic shows you a breakdown of all new disaster displacements since 2008 by hazard type. As you can see, 89% were displaced by weather-related events, while 11% were displaced by geophysical events such as earthquake or volcanic eruptions. Climate change has proven to increase the frequency and intensity of sudden onset events, such as floods, storms, and wildfires. According to the recently released report of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As you can see, sudden onset events were indeed responsible for a high number of disaster displacements in recent years. Now, the relationship between climate change and displacement becomes more complex if we look at slow onset events, such as heat waves, sea level rise, and desertification. It is clear, and it has been proven, that these are directly linked to climate change. To which extent they are directly linked to displacement is, however, unclear, as slow onset events interact with a number of other drivers of human mobility, such as loss of livelihoods, the hope to find better access to services or education, but also conflict and violence, as we will see later. Models can help forecast the risk of future displacement and thereby provide governments and populations with useful information on how to best prevent and prepare for disasters. Together with ETH Zurich, Meteo Suisse, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and UN OCHA, IDMC contributed to a model forecasting changes in flood displacement risk, considering different climate change and development scenarios. The results are shown in this graph. I maybe explain it for a second because it's a bit complex. The light blue shaded area shows average changes in flood displacement risk with strong greenhouse gas mitigation efforts, aiming at keeping the temperature rises below 2 degrees as compared to pre-industrial levels. The purple shaded area shows average changes in flood displacement risk with higher emissions, representing a temperature increase of about 3 to 3.5 degrees as compared to pre-industrial levels, and an unequal development path. Dashed lines represent the average values across models. As you can see, flood displacement risk increases as greenhouse gas emissions go up. The results shown in this graph also take future population growth into account. However, even if the population remains stable at current levels, which is unlikely, the model finds that flood displacement risk increases by roughly 50% for each additional degree of global warming. Another model developed by the World Bank and that has recently been published in the Groundswell report forecasts how slow onset climate change impacts water availability and crop productivity as well as sea level rise will impact future internal migration trends. This model predicts that up to 216 million people could migrate within their own countries by 2050 under the most pessimistic scenario. This number could, however, be cut to as little as 48 million by adopting more climate-friendly policies and investing in sustainable development. As I have mentioned before, displacement can be triggered by a variety of interconnected drivers, particularly when it comes to slow onset events. It comes therefore as no surprise that also conflict, disaster, and climate change displacement overlap or even reinforce each other, leading to repeated displacement and trapping people in a downward spiral of vulnerability and risk. This slide shows only a few possibilities of how climate change and environmental change, disaster risk, conflict, fragility, and displacement can interact. Rising temperatures and overexploitation of resources can, for example, trigger water scarcity, which in turn can create tensions over water sources and conflict, which eventually can lead to displacement. The Liptako-Gourma region in the Sahel is one of the most prominent examples of how climate change and climate shocks can fuel conflict. The area between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has suffered prolonged periods of drought in recent years, resulting in land and water scarcity and fueling conflicts between farmers and pastoralists. Extremist groups have managed to exploit the situation and expand their influence across all three countries. Their activities have triggered almost 1 million of new displacements in 2020. Displacement triggered by conflict and violence can, however, also push people to settle on marginal or hazard-prone lands or in makeshift shelters, which don't offer much protection against disasters and climate change impacts. This has happened in Yemen, where floods and storms have led to over 200,000 new displacements in 2020, exceeding the numbers triggered by fighting between the government and the Houthi movement. Many of those uprooted by extreme weather events had been previously displaced by the ongoing conflict and were living in makeshift shelters and informal settlements, particularly vulnerable to flooding. It would, of course, be wrong to automatically associate high climate change vulnerability with a high risk for conflict displacement, as conflict is always driven by a range of complex factors, with climate change only being one of them. However, the extent to which climate change vulnerability coincides with conflict displacement is certainly worrying. As this infographic shows, 95% of all new conflict displacement in 2020 was taking place in countries that were either vulnerable or even highly vulnerable to climate change impacts, according to the Notre Dame Gain Index. This map only refers to internal displacement, but the situation is very similar for refugees. According to UNHCR statistics, 90% of the refugees come from countries most vulnerable to climate change. Clearly, more research is needed to understand exactly how conflict, fragility, natural hazard, and climate change interact, and under which conditions they can create the perfect storm for displacement. Particularly, the role slow onset events play in triggering displacement and migration needs to be further explored, including through modeling efforts. Existing data and evidence, however, already clearly shows that our responses to climate change, disasters, and conflict displacement can no longer happen in silos, and that it's time for the humanitarian and development community to start working more closely together with climate change, disaster risk reduction, and peace-building actions, which is also one of the key recommendations of the high-level panel on internal displacement in its recently released report. I stop here for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Essig. We can see that IDMC has been, throughout its existence over 20 years now, has been really the reference and is the reference organization when it comes to data on internal displacement. And I believe that we can go to the policy side then in the discussion part of this session. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dina Ionescu, my former colleague from IOM Research Division at many years ago, we could say. Dina has, after these research efforts, she has then led for many years IOM's division on environmental migration and climate change. But now actually she is between two jobs. She has, is moving on to work for Climate Vulnerable Forum and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so continuing the same important and quite pioneering work that she has been doing with IOM. Before IOM, she worked with OECD, and before her working career, she acquired quite impressive academic credentials from Sciences Po in Paris. She has a Master in European Studies from Sussex University, and also a degree, postgrad degree from London School of Economics on international business. So obviously that has been all very important for your current professional activities. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Heike, for such a wonderful presentation, introduction, and thank you to Webster, particularly Jabin, for all the organization of such an interesting and great event. I'm indeed maybe migrating still a bit in between my jobs, and also I'm very happy because I will also work much closer also with Webster University, so it's extremely important for me to be here today. So in this panel today, we tried with Barbara and Atle, who is in Glasgow, and who will speak, I think, really from the heat point, to be complementary in our presentation. So my presentation looks much more on a broader scope and on human mobility, different type of approaches, including what we just heard on, more focused on internal displacement. And I'm focusing on the human security perspective. And I think this is a great opportunity. I think the concept of human security is a very powerful concept, very interesting and strong one. And I think it's key for, as soon as we speak of migration, to speak, in fact, of human security. And in the concept of human security, there is the whole human rights dimension, which I think it's clearly at the heart of absolutely everything that this conference wants to bring to the forefront. But there are also key concepts that are the concept of freedom, of dignity. I think what it's, and it has the word human, and so it brings humanity, what's the most important thing, into the perspective of what we discuss. And very often we realize also that we speak of climate change in very scientific and disembodied terms, that take us away a bit from the human perspective. And I think that's what has happened with human mobility in the past years in the connection with climate change, is that we brought back human dimension, as much the positive and the negatives, the responsibilities, the victims, and the heroes, in a way, of the fight now for climate action. So my presentation is in 3 times. The first one, just for the very short approach on what we are talking about, the key concepts. The second part, I'm looking at some examples. And the third part, I conclude on some policy and multilateral discussion that we touched upon in the opening speech. I found extremely visionary, we heard today. And that connects to what Atle will also discuss after. So in terms of concepts and approach, I will be very, very short and very simple. I think what it's very interesting to see is that we discuss a lot migration, we discuss displacement, we discuss human mobility. There is no one single definition, in fact, still, that puts everyone into agreement when we speak about human mobility in the context of climate change and environmental degradation. And we have to be honest about it intellectually and to, in a way, accept it. And the community who works on this topic is now used to address this different dimension, also according to different processes. For instance, in the climate negotiations, now we have human mobility with displacement dimension for everything that's very much in its force forms, and also migration and planned relocation dimension of migration. Here I put human mobility to be broader, like a more umbrella kind of term, and I used environmental migration, though once again this is not a legal definition, that doesn't exist, as climate refugees don't exist legally, and there's not even one single legal definition of migration and international migration. So it's still a domain where states are sovereign also on the way they define these realities. So and it's very different also if we speak in statistical terms, for instance, or in policy terms or technical terms on how we define migration. So environmental migration, here it's more a definition that shows that the environmental drivers are very important, and that they always interact with other factors. That migration is always a multi-causal phenomenon. And it's our topic today, it's at the crossroads of different economic and social and political factors. And what Barbara presented as well shows the connection with conflict issues and how complex it is, and that there is no direct causality link. So I think this slide shows the complexity of what is at stake. And also that we speak of human mobility patterns and types of movements, we speak of so many different realities. We speak of internal migration and regional migration and international migration. We can speak of return migration, people who migrated once and return on many times. We have displacement triggered by disasters, by conflict. It's all this, it's there. And that's all of importance. And my presentation today aims to show this, that a human security and perspective to human mobility will show the importance of all these types of migration patterns in our contemporary world. And climate change is an exacerbating element that accelerates very often non-climatic factors, in particular land degradation or ecosystem loss. And the last point on this slide highlights once again what I said before, that there is no one single terminology and one single legal framework, and that has impacts also in terms of projects, programs, and all policy responses we have in this domain. So the human security lens applied to migration, what does it mean? It means really to put vulnerable people at the center of policies and responses. And when we speak of vulnerability and migration, it's not just the negative dimension and the tragedy that unfortunately is a reality of our world, but it's also the fact that migration can have an adaptative dimension, that it can take people out of harm's way, and also that people have always migrated. So that it's a reality of humanity, and that it can be, in a way, done in a positive way. But I think this vulnerability, it's very important in terms of also the human potential of migration and the well-being of people, and not to look just at the negative and very tragic dimension of migration. And then when we speak of human security lens applied to migration, we of course will speak of food security, water security, environmental security, safe housing, health, livelihood security. All those are influenced by climate change negative impacts, and all those can lead to different mobility partners. So climate change is really a multiplier that exacerbates also the vulnerabilities of the communities. And for the climate conference, for instance, happening today, it's very important to both look at countries most vulnerable to climate change, but to also understand that absolutely all countries are affected, and that the poverty dimension that appears when we speak of human security in migration, it's a reality also in very rich countries. This brings me to my second part of my presentation, where I'm looking at some very specific examples just to showcase what does it mean to look at human security in contemporary migration patterns. And each of these examples has a policy, a legal, and technical dimension to it, and also it's of importance in what happens now in Glasgow. Each of these examples has an entry door in what is going on in Glasgow right now, and I will try to highlight this. So one key connection that we haven't spoken yet when we spoke about internal displacement, but which is directly related and I wanted to bring up, is the human trafficking dimension. This is at the heart of the complexity of contemporary human mobility. We have now quite a number of studies, and I gave here some examples from Asia, from the Indian Ocean tsunami already, but also some drought assessments from Cambodia from 2016 that show that unfortunately, when there is a disaster that leads to displacement, there is higher risk for trafficking in persons. And so that has a direct impact on rights, human rights approaches that need to be recognized strongly in Glasgow. They are recognized, for instance, in the Paris Agreement, but there is a strong focus now on much more action on human rights and climate change. There's a new rapporteur with the human rights on human rights and climate change, that position that has just been approved, and that in terms of technical and policy responses, there are a lot of things that can be done before, during, and after disasters, before, during, and after migration or displacement to reduce the risk and protect the people. That's one first example of the complexity of what we have at hand. My second example, it's really about the health dimension related to the pandemic and studies we have now. And I encourage you to look on IOM's website. There's an extremely interesting series of blogs that connect health, the pandemic, migration, and climate change from a very wide range of researchers around the world. And all this shows so many different situations. And that what happened now has increased the vulnerability of people already vulnerable. And in particular, something that we don't speak enough when we speak of migration is those who don't migrate. So what we call the trapped population. And it shows that migration, you need means to be able to migrate out of a situation of conflict or disaster. So we saw a stronger impact on population not being able to resort to mobility, to get out of harm's way, but also people who were using, for instance, seasonal migration as a way to go and come back and have a whole mobility related to labor and seasonal migration that was stopped by all the hindrances we had on human mobility. So the pandemic showed the importance, vital importance of mobility in livelihoods, and also that we need to prioritize more action that connect health and environmental challenges. My third example looks more specifically in particular hazards that are slow onset and that are very difficult to measure. It's much easier now to have the data, and IDMC has made major efforts also on having more slow onset data, in particular on droughts and desertification. So we have now a better understanding how much land degradation and drought and desertification connected to bad land management also have an impact on vulnerable populations who are very dependent on agriculture. And we have very interesting work done by the United Nations Desertification Convention to connect land management with human mobility dimension, and also for having returnees, people who return back home, to have projects that are about land management to allow them to stay, in fact, and to have a new livelihood. So once again, I think it shows also the complexity we have, that it's not just displacement. It's also a choice. Very often, families will make a choice to send one person, for instance, who is affected by a drought, a family affected by the drought, to send one person to the city. And it's part of the human, once again, of human mobility patterns. My fourth example, it's about the complex situation around pastoralism, the impact of climate change. So it's, again, a very different model and example, because it speaks about populations that live out of mobility. And we saw climate change impacts, for instance, changes in rainfall that have impacted their roads of mobility, and that led to conflict with between herders and farmers of a natural resources. And unfortunately, we have, for instance, examples from Kenya and different examples from Sahel about this also complex situation. So once again, yet another type of issue and complex situation that speaks of mobility, of climate change, and of the security, human security and vulnerability of people. And this one, it's about sea level rise, coastal erosion, floods, and pressure on people living in coastal zones, on low-lying zones. And the response here, it's again a human mobility response, is the planned relocation. So that, again, the Cancun Agreement from 2010 in the climate negotiation has recognized displacement, migration, and planned relocation as part of the adaptation strategies of the adaptation to climate change agenda in the climate negotiation. So this, again, the response to a human security situation impacted by climate change and leads to a type of organized form of migration. It's yet another example of how much this nexus, migration, climate change, and human security has different facets. The legal perspective I chose here is just to remind you of the case that has taken place 2 years ago between Mr. Ioane Teitota from Kiribati and New Zealand. And I put it here because there has been a lot of interest in the media about this case that has been presented as the first case maybe of a climate refugee. And in fact, the claim was rejected by the United Nations Human Rights Committee. The application, just to explain, so it was rejected, but what is very important is the committee recognized the importance of the non-refoulement right. So if he returns to a situation that puts his life into peril, he should not be returned. And what has been the complex discussion here, it's the threshold of the climate change impact. When is this threshold high enough so it puts into peril his life? And it was recognized that it was not. So it's not a case that creates such a new status, but it shows the complexity of the question, that there will be much more like this, and that there are loads of possible responses, in particular visa responses and other kind of policy responses, not just creating one single status focused on climate change and people moving and crossing a border. So to conclude my presentation, I just in 1 minute highlight the multilateral policy responses that are maybe active right now on this topic. First of all, there is the whole focus that has changed, I think, over the past 5 years on the development and humanitarian and peace nexus, and a new way of working of the HDPN, where there is an increased attention to climate change into the humanitarian response. And there are a few mechanisms, like the climate security mechanism that was established in 2018 that looks at climate change impact, security, risk, and where there is now also a migration focus. And the second bit, and I will let Atle continue on this, it's really how the migration multilateral agenda and the climate change multilateral agenda can advance the issue. So we have now a global compact for safe, regular, orderly migration that has recognized environmental and climate change aspects very clearly in its objective 2 and 5. States have signed this. It's not binding, but it's one of the most advanced multilateral texts we have on migration of our, I think, contemporary history. So it's there, and there will be a reporting mechanism in 2022, which I think it's extremely important to showcase how countries are taking very concrete, innovative migration policy action to respond to the question. For instance, visas, humanitarian visas in particular, or temporary protection visa. And the last point, of course, it's what is going on the climate side. I think COPs can't solve it all, at all. I think COPs are just a very long time process. They are key to multilateralism, and they are key to this action on climate change. And I think now, after 15 years of efforts, what matters is that in the climate space, in the climate convention, in the negotiated text, in Paris Agreement, for our topic, what matters is that migrants' rights are recognized. There is also a recognition in the adaptation agenda, in the loss and damage agenda, and much more can be done. And I put there some entry doors, how we can put more migration in the nationally determined contribution, in the national adaptation plans, in the Santiago network on loss and damage. And I think there is space for increased action, but we should not, I think, be naive about events. There, I think what's there, and I let Atle continue, I think it's very important, but we are still human, so let's be both modest and very ambitious. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina. These certainly need some ambitious thought of all of us, because these are so complex issues. And some observations of this presentation could be that that there are very much similar migration and displacement challenges that were already pre-existing, but the climate change is aggravating them very seriously, and also then giving some pressure to some, let's say, intergovernmental and other international cooperation for finding solutions to old and new migration challenges, which come in some stages from this, that, okay, climate change causes displacements, but rather sudden and then or slower, but then solutions have to be found for these people, sometimes quite urgently. Now I'm happy to see Mr. Solberg already on the screen, and just briefly introducing him. He's the head of Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, with the background of a political scientist of Norway, and he has done also some research and teaching in the University of Bergen, and has quite extensive humanitarian experience from UNHCR, OCHA, and Norwegian Refugee Council of displacement context, both in conflict and natural hazard situations. And we are very happy to open the connection to Glasgow and hear the latest of these very, very important climate talks. So, Mr. Solberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mattila. Can you hear me okay? Can somebody give me a heads up? A thumbs up? Yeah, I think I see somebody in the room. So, good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from Glasgow. I'm actually sitting in a meeting room which is no longer in use, but I may run the risk of being kicked out. But let's hope I can stay with you. And I'm also, since we are a bit late, in some time constraints, I need to be in another meeting at 10 o'clock. So I'll see what I can communicate to you in the minutes I have at my disposal. As Mr. Mattila said, I work for something called the Platform on Disaster Displacement. We have a secretariat based in Geneva, and we are a state-led initiative, and we very much work around implementation of what is referred to as the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. I'm calling you from COP, and one question I wanted to put forward, or just remind ourselves, so why would we, working on displacement and human mobility issues, why would we even attending a conference of the parties? If you remember the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992, does not mention displacement, does not mention migration, and it has a very specific focus. It is to stabilize greenhouse gas emission at a level that would be, or at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So that is the objective of the United Nations Framework Convention, and that's important to remind ourselves. I think one reason that we are in Glasgow working on human mobility and displacement issues, and I think both Barbara and Dina made a very compelling case, is that climate change is increasingly a factor impacting human mobility and displacement. And it seems like we are not able to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And that's why we have run out of that toolbox in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emission. And increasingly, after 1992, the discussion has also been about adaptation. How do we adapt to the adverse effect of climate change? And more recently, particularly after the Paris Agreement, we have a new language in the Paris Agreement, which we didn't have in 1992, which is loss and damage. And I will talk to you a little around loss and damage and displacement. So the title for my presentation, Averting, Minimizing, and Addressing Internal Displacement in a Changing Climate, the Role of Climate Action, is not an accident or a coincidence. The notion of averting, minimize, and addressing loss and damage is very much a climate change term. And again, it did not, it was not part of the terminology in the 1992 convention. It only made its inroads into the climate change negotiation in 2007, and it's only with the Paris Agreement that we have the language of loss and damage into an international treaty. So what I will talk to you today, I hope I can get through the 3 points. A little how human mobility made inroads into the climate change negotiation, very much with the recognition that we were unable to reduce greenhouse gas emission and that we were into dangerous territory in terms of anthropogenic human interference. So that's one part. Then I will specifically explain a little how displacement and loss and damage has been part of the Paris Agreement under the Framework Convention. And thirdly, a little what happens here at Glasgow. We are in the final days of the negotiations. There is some text already clear. It's very hard to make an overall assessment. Are we talking half full, half empty glass? I think it's clearly that commitments to reduce emissions is not at the level that are needed. We heard from Barbara on the IPCC report. We need to have more commitment to reduce greenhouse gases, and we also need more capacity to adapt and deal with loss and damage. So first, let's see a little on why and when did human mobility make its way into the climate change negotiation and text. And there was very much talk about 10, 11, 12 years ago about the human phase or the human implication of climate change. And one milestone in trying to get those issues more prominent in the negotiation, we can see in the Cancun adaptation framework, which took place in 2010 and was then the conference of the parties in Mexico in 2010. And what was important in Cancun is that parties recognized that there is a need to better understand, to better coordinate and better cooperate around what they refer to as regard to climate change induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation. So that's the first time we get mobility language into a negotiated text under the Framework Convention. And why is that important? It's important for a few things. Let's say 3 things at least. One is that the parties then recognize that one consequence of the adverse effect of climate change is then human mobility. So you recognize that that is one of the side effects of climate change. And that gives you then opportunities to work with climate change as a policy and action area. Secondly, it is also a very strong call for more adaptation, more resilience in order to reduce the risk of people compelled to move, but also that adaptation will help also people to stay and having a resilient livelihood and so forth. And then a third very important aspect of this decision is that mobility in itself can be an adaptive measure. So you could think of people moving in order to anticipate risks or a hazard, but also that the mobility process in itself is empowering and can create resilience. And this is something we refer to sometimes as migration, as adaptation. Dina knows much more about this than I do, but it's also an important notion that mobility in itself can generate development and resilience. So that's important. So that was 2010, mobility is making then its inroads into the climate change negotiation. As I mentioned, loss and damage as a notion or a concept did not figure in the Framework Convention from 1992. So it's only in Bali in 2007, there's a reference to loss and damage. And in 2013, you have, under the Conference of the Parties at its 19th session in Doha, you have the establishment of something called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, or the Warsaw International Mechanism associated with climate change impact. And that's the important milestone in the negotiation. And it's a sad milestone because it reflects a growing recognition that we are, in certain circumstances, beyond adaptation. That the impact of climate change can also go beyond what can be done with mitigation and adaptation. And then you clearly have displacement as one area where we have a displacement seen as a consequence of the adverse effect of climate change. And displacement is, you could conceptualize it, is if people are compelled to move, we have failed both on mitigation and adaptation. This is clearly, and I think Barbara explained that very well to us, that not all movement is of course linked to the adverse effect of climate change, and we have to be careful about the multi-causality. But you could think of places where, for example, sea level rise or desertification, clearly linked to the adverse effect of climate change, make it impossible to live. And that is clearly loss and damage territory, and it is a form of displacement. What's important about the words of international mechanism is that in 2013, you then got a work plan or a work stream under the convention that, or under the mechanism that worked on human mobility. And that made also it possible for people like DINA and IOM, the High Commission for Refugee, ourselves, to work with human mobility under a subsidiary body of the convention. I will now move very quickly to the Paris Agreement, because what we see in 2015 with the adoption of the Paris Agreement is that on one side, we first have explicit reference to loss and damage in an international treaty. So that's very important. There are important caveats. Then the reference to loss and damage in the Paris Agreement was only possible with the caveat that it should not imply any forms of compensation. So that suggests that it's a very difficult political thing. But you have loss and damage included in the Paris Agreement, but the decision clearly spells out that it doesn't imply any responsibility for compensation. What the Conference of the Parties in Paris did, which is very important for our work, is that it mandated the Executive Committee to establish a task force on displacement. And the task force on displacement was asked to develop recommendations on integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement. So we had a very clear reference to displacement and other forms of human mobility, and we had a task ahead, a mandate given to us by the Conference of the Parties. So with IDMC and colleagues of Barbara, IOM colleagues of DINA, or previous colleagues, we worked for several years to develop these recommendations on integrated approaches on how to avert, minimize, and address displacement. And in Katowice, these recommendations were welcomed by the parties. And it is a package of recommendation that talks to all the important policy areas we need to implement. It's around comprehensive risk management, early warning preparedness, integration between different policy streams that Barbara alluded to, bringing disaster risk reduction, human mobility, dealing with science, dealing with financing, and technology and capacity building. So that has been a very important place for us to work. So what happened after Katowice? The negotiation around loss and damage is not moving very quickly. There is one of the most difficult texts that are being negotiated at this Conference of the Parties. One reason, and I'm not sure whether I was able to explain that very well, is that even though the Paris Agreement in its Article 8 talks about loss and damage, the decision to the Paris Agreement makes clear that there is no compensation linked to that inclusion in Article 8. And that means the issue of financing for loss and damage is unresolved. There is no clear financing mechanism. And loss and damage also sits oddly in the overall agenda. So there is negotiating on how to strengthen the financing and the capacity to address loss and damage. So we have a draft text on loss and damage and also on the work of the Task Force on Displacement being adopted in this COP that is probably as far as they could get in this Conference of the Parties. Many decisions, including related to something called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, that will be very important in order to strengthen action and support on loss and damage, has been or is currently being discussed, but will probably be more prominent as we move to next Conference of the Parties in Egypt. So Heikki, I think I need to wrap up a little. What I've tried to share with you today is how the issue of mobility and displacement has increasingly been part of the climate change negotiation. And one reason for that is, of course, that we are failing in our initial efforts, objective to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The adverse effect of climate change is increasing, and we will see more mobility, different types of mobility that we have to deal with. And in that sense, it's very positive that we are incrementally building up decision and mechanism under the convention to deal with these issues. So that's a very positive aspect. But we have to be careful not to overload the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. We have to go back to its initial objective and really also try to bring all these challenges around displacement and loss and damage to other policy areas, such as disaster risk reduction, humanitarian assistance, human rights, and very much the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm sorry to rush this towards the end of this presentation, but in 7 minutes I need to be in another meeting group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atle, for opening for us these, you could say, intricacies of the climate negotiation and migration management. Somehow, and of course it was somewhat pessimistic as we heard that, okay, these ambitious goals of 1.5 degrees cap doesn't look that good. But all the same, it is very important work that you all are doing in bringing in migration management viewpoints and displacement management viewpoints into these very important key documents that there are now in international, intergovernmental and international cooperation. So we are running a little bit late, so maybe we would have 10 minutes or so max for discussion. I would like to open the floor for questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you so much for the insight and the valuable information and sharing us with the knowledge that opened our eyes and to see that climate change and its impacts, it concerns us and humanity in essence. Considering the quantitative and qualitative data and knowledge that you showed us and shared with us, do you think that there should be a legal framework regarding climate change and, quote unquote, its impacts, which compels or in essence requires the developed countries to help those in need, irrespective of the fact that they may be providing aid? If yes, will it have a meaningful impact on the whole system? In your humble opinion, if you could share your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Sorry? Would you like to answer now, or should we take other questions? If you have an answer ready, so go ahead, please.
Thank you. I can give part maybe of trying to respond. I find over the past years that looking on how to respond with legal responses to this very complex situation, I think there is not one single response, in fact, and one single solution, but I see like a pack of solutions. And for the legal dimension and creating one status around people who move because of climate change, I think the biggest issue we have is how you isolate just the climate change impacts and how can you ask someone to prove the climate change dimension. And I'm worried that it's in a way leading to the opposite effect of what we want as more protection, because then if you can't prove it, or if you come from a very poor situation but you can't really prove climate change impacts, you end up with less protection than more. So as bizarre as it is, because I've been working now for 10 years to highlight the environmental and climate change factors of migration, the more I work on this, the more I think that having one single status focus on that, it's not the response. And also, as we presented a lot of this, it's about internal migration. It also leaves out all these people who move internally. So I think it's much more a question of being with solutions that come from the urban, from agriculture, from health, from education, from development. So everyone is concerned, one. And second, I believe that migration policy can be much more innovative. And I have enough of seeing this happening. It can be so much more about regional agreements and bilateral agreements. We have examples, but it can be much more about original vision about visas and entry and stay and fluidity of mobility. And I really think there's a lot there that can be done that it's not there. And that's why also, as Atlas says, I think it's very important not to overload the climate negotiations. There it's about climate action, thinking and taking into account migration, but it's also about migration policy now that has to integrate climate change and be a bit more innovative. And but for me, there is not the solution. In fact, the status, I think the more I think about it, the less I think it's the solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. And Ms. Essig would like to add something.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for this very comprehensive answer already, Dina, and also for the excellent question. Just to say that on the protection aspect, I fully agree with you. There's also a reason, I think it wasn't mentioned in this conference this time, but there's always a discussion about whether, the 1951 Refugee Convention should be adapted to include climate refugees, and for the very same reasons that Dina just mentioned, it has been decided not to do it. But what I just wanted to add concerning your question, because from what I've understood, it was also about adaptation financing and whether you should find a way of making developed countries pay for climate change impacts. And I think just looking at it from a very pragmatic point of view, I don't think it's something that's going to happen. I'm sorry to be very blunt about it, but I think it has been tried many times, and as Atle mentioned, and also very well described, the whole process of including only loss and damage in the COP outcome documents. I don't think, it's something that would be realistic anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kodasi. Jubin, you had a
Yeah,
question.
I know we have coffee break time very soon. I just had a comment or reaction. It's in part to Madame Essig's observation earlier in her presentation, but she mentioned that so far climate change has not led to migrations, population flows outside of certain countries and continents. Perhaps that's the case right now. I came across last week a report which I found very alarming that out of the 50-something countries in Africa, 40 right now are experiencing drought. And we have the reports. I mean, I think you and Dina know far better than I do, are much more knowledgeable in this respect than Heikki also. We've had the impact of climate change in Latin American countries, Central America, parts of Asia. Many people don't know that one of the contributing factors, I'm not saying it was the main factor, for the 2011 crisis in Syria was that in the 5 years preceding the unrest in Syria, of course, there were many other reasons, political, etc., economic, Syria experienced 5 consecutive years of drought. And then, of course, we saw what happened later on, although the 2015 migration crisis was to some degree manipulated by Turkey, in my opinion. So we're not there yet, or hopefully we will never get to that point, but I just wanted to throw this at at you and maybe Dina in terms of what you think how things may evolve in the future if we do not take appropriate action. And this relates to what Dr. Hieronymi was in a sense saying earlier in his keynote address, that a lot of these things, whether environmental, climate change, economic, political, are related, and we've seen that in terms of the rising demagogues, both on the other side of the Atlantic and in Europe, over the past several years, they've made migration, refugee flows a major issue, and it's a political hot potato that the far right tries to exploit. My fear is that the situation may continue to deteriorate, and this may continue then to undermine liberal democratic traditions in the North, and where you'd have demagogues and people like Trump, or maybe somebody like Eric Zemmour or whatever, Alternative for Deutschland or SVP here gain more ground. So again, kind of trying to connect the dots. So anyway, if you have any comments, I'd be glad to hear the views of the experts. Thank you.
Will Dina start answering?
It's very tough, but I would say I think it's very interesting. We are in a humanitarian conference now. So what you just explained, I find, comes very strongly in the humanitarian context, because we'll have to think of the protection of people, we have to think of the poverty, we have to think of all the combined effects that lead people to be displaced or to move in big numbers. But I think there's the same discussion we have in a development conference, a climate conference, an environment conference, a human rights conference. Each of these, it's like a diamond with different facets. And I think that the migration bit of the diamond is extremely difficult to predict and complex, because it matters also how much the migration policy evolves. So are there, for instance, in Eastern and Western Africa, free movement protocols that can cover also disaster and climate change dimension, that can be, for instance, the response and be already a sign of management? And are countries prepared to deal with it? Are we thinking of planned relocation already in some? What are we doing with people who can't move, the trapped population? So I think for me, it's very important to think of all these facets and dimensions, that each has an impact on the other, and that on the bigger picture, I would say to keep hope, because when you work on this, you can easily get depressed by the horribility, like the tragedy, the ugliness of humanity, the worst, the situation of the people, the fears, the alarmist also vision of it. And I think what I feel is that we need to also look at the solutions, at the hope, at the positive dimension of migration, of the innovative migration responses that can be put in place to encourage every person to work at his and her level on the environment action and climate action. So even if we are in a humanitarian conference where we are facing the worst of our humanity, I think the response lays with some hope and investment in everything that's positive. Even if tiny, it matters. So for me, that's the key message I would respond to you, because the question is so big. There's no one solution, once again, what I was saying. I think there are hundreds of solutions, and there are hundreds of ugliness ongoing. But the hundreds of solutions can be stronger. I really believe this.
Thank you very much, Dina. Jupin really opened the box and let certain snakes out, because yes, migration has so many ramifications, and that makes it fascinating as a topic, but so challenging. And often it's for the migration and displacement people then to somehow to try to influence others, as is taking place in Glasgow now. And Dina has worked for Glasgow documents so that migration is taken into account in these sort of other contexts and in other fields. So Jupin, I think, started with certain internal displacement issues, so I let Ms. Essig respond and address them.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. It's true, it's a very pertinent one and a very relevant one. Although I think that Dina has covered it again very comprehensively, so I don't really know what to add to it, other than maybe emphasize her call for solutions, and that, because I really think that needs to be the way forward. It is true that we all don't know how migration will look, or if one day internal displacement might be increasingly fuel also movement that go across borders. It's simply impossible to know what will happen in 50 years. But I think the most constructive way forward is definitely to focus on solutions. Dina has mentioned a number of regional initiative, free movement protocols that really have potential to also be adopted in other regions around the world. So I think the focus on solutions is the good one. And it's true that eventual future climate change fueled migration movements might also fuel far-right movements or extremists. But I think by our best way of dealing with that is just maybe have a discourse that as much as possible based on facts. And that's also what we're trying to do. And that's why we always, as IDMC, continue to repeat that for now, what we see, it is internal movements. And for now, it's not the time for alarmist predictions yet. I think I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we need to go to coffee break now in order to let the next... let's take that last question. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much for accepting my question. So I'm Narana Ikhchum from Webster. My question is about the balance between economic development, climate change, environmental protection, and also cultural loss caused by migration. I'm referring to this because in my country, Mongolia has, I would say, is a good example to look at because it has a higher rate of warming than the global average. And the nomads, as Ms. Ionescu talked about pastoralism, there's a loss of, they're forced to move, and it's really becoming harder to become a nomad in Mongolia because of climate change, desertification, and also government policies that discriminate against these people because the economy is very much based on mining. So there's some kind of conflict of interest between protecting its culture with nomadism, developing its economy, and also climate protection. So, I'm just using Mongolia as an example, but my general question is just how shall we balance these three elements, cultural protection, environmental protection, and economic development? Thank you.
Yes, Dina, please.
Do you want to start? No? No, I find this is an excellent question as well, and I think Mongolia is such an example of what's happening at climate change level, the impacts on livelihoods and changes in patterns and urbanization and loss of cultural. You put it all, in fact, in your question, all this, and I think, when you work on this topic and you go to different meetings, if you speak with environmentalists, and you say we should help people move, they are unhappy because they think we dropped all mitigation efforts and we don't want to change, to invest in the environment for people to stay. And if you go in a conference and you speak to people who are the civil society defenders of migrants, and you say people should stay, they are unhappy because they say, well, migration should be a right and you should be able to move. So you will never be able to respond to everything. There will always be contradictory dimension. And for me, here again, it shows the key issue of human rights, and the key importance of recognizing culture and the loss of culture. And there is a lot ongoing in the migration, environment, and climate change community of practice that looks at the cultural loss, in particular from small island states that have to relocate maybe totally. There's a lot of work also on indigenous knowledge that supports adaptation. So I think once again, there won't be any single solution because you speak also of very complex economic issues and political choices. But once again, there can be a human rights response. There is a cultural heritage preservation response. There is an adaptation. There is a support to migrants. There is there are always different facets, I think. I come back to this because I think that once again, you won't solve it with the magic wand. But it's a beautiful question, a beautiful country, and very, once again, we speak of the heart of humanity. So we have to be able to preserve it and it's the complexity of migration. Sometimes migration is the way to preserve your, in fact, identity, and sometimes it's unfortunately also a dilution and a loss. We have to accept, I think, that's humanity. But don't stop the fight for the human rights and for the preservation of the cultural heritage, and anything can help, I think.
Thank you very much, Dina, and thank you for the very well formulated question also. We now need to go to the coffee break because we are late. We can maybe just say that, Mike. Sorry?
Yes, since we will take we're going to shift, so we'll take the coffee break now, and we'll start the next session at 11:30. So you can anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you for participation, and thank you for the panelists.
Yeah, very good. Excellent.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 6th session of our 26th Humanitarian and Security Conference. I'm glad to welcome today Dr. McIver and Ms. Ali, and also Ms. Roedel, who will join us online in about 30-40 minutes. This session theme is the future of planetary health and the protection of vulnerable population. Our first speaker will be Lachlan McIver, who is a medical doctor original from Australia, specializing in rural medicine, tropical medicine, and public health. He is currently employed as the Tropical Diseases and Planetary Health Advisor at Médecins Sans Frontières Operational Center, Geneva. Prior to joining MSF in 2016, Lachlan spent several years as a consultant for the WHO in the fields of emergency humanitarian action and environmental health. He did his PhD on the health impacts of climate change while working for the WHO South Pacific Office. He is an adjunct associate professor of tropical medicine at James Cook University and the co-founder of Rocket Ship Pacific Limited, a small global health NGO focused on improving health in Pacific Island countries through stronger primary care. Lachlan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that very well-worded introduction that I wrote, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. I was just saying to Professor Gudazi what an interesting privilege it is for me to be interacting with colleagues at the nexus of our important areas of work. So to be interacting with experts in the fields of climate change, migration, policy, and security is fascinating for me. So thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute. So I'm going to be talking today about what we're referring to as planetary health. As you may know, it is customary in Australia to begin presentations and meetings with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I'm sorry, I haven't done sufficient homework to know who are the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, but I'm from the home of the Mamu people, a rainforest people in northeast Queensland in the tropical rainforests. And I think it's fair to say that Indigenous people have a far greater understanding of the links between the environment and health than most of us who are from different backgrounds. So I'm going to talk today about what we mean by planetary health, and hopefully that will sort of explain why I'm here today and why this item has been included on the schedule for this meeting. A little bit of a look back as to what MSF has been working on in relation to planetary health in order that we can understand where we are heading with this work. I'll briefly review the science and evidence of why this is an important topic that affects us all. Discuss briefly some of the implications for MSF's work in the field and consider what that looks like, and paint a very brief or very small, vague picture of where we need to go as a global community. So at MSF Operational Centre Geneva, there's been some vigorous internal debate as to how to define this topic of planetary health, which is one of our 5 strategic pillars. Being a medical humanitarian organisation primarily focused on human health, we've agreed on a definition that planetary health refers to health problems in human populations related to the interactions between humans, animals, and the environment. Now, this is a necessarily anthropocentric perspective, but as you can imagine, MSF is not willing, at least at this point in time, to engage in the health of animals or the health of other non-human species. That may be something for a later discussion. What that means for MSF is that we are focusing on 3 particular areas. One is the medical operational implications of planetary health, as well as considering our own ecological footprint, in particular our carbon emissions, and how we need to act responsibly as a humanitarian actor, and also what our role and value add can be in terms of communications and advocacy. To give you a sense of what that definition means materially or medically, if you think about the types of health problems that arise from the interactions between humans, animals, and the environment, in reviewing the last 10 years of MSF's activity reports, this word cloud shows the relative frequency of the main categories of planetary health-related medical issue. You can see immediately that there are some key themes that emerge from this word cloud. Among the most common problems for MSF to face in the places where we work related to this interaction between humans, animals and the environment are diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, such as malaria and dengue fever, diseases related to water, particularly contaminated water, such as diarrheal disease, including cholera, malnutrition, natural disasters, and neglected or emerging infectious diseases. I'm sorry this bar chart doesn't appear very clear. The purpose of including it is to show that of all the countries where MSF Operational Centre Geneva has worked in the last 10 years, these problems overlap, both in time and in category. So there are multiple places in the world where these planetary health problems occur at the same time and occur over and over again. And I think this links quite nicely with some of the maps that colleagues displayed in the previous session, showing the overlaying vulnerability of various populations to climate change and disasters and other forces driving things like migration. We're going to have a brisk romp through the evidence linking planetary health and human health, in particular climate change. I'm not going to go into detail into this diagram, but it's important to understand that there are different pathways by which climate change affects human health. That includes both direct effects, such as heat and natural disasters, and indirect effects, such as those that relate to, for example, the habitats of mosquitoes, or the other ways in which infectious diseases can be transmitted, as well as effects on chronic diseases, people with pre-existing conditions, air pollution, mental health, and other categories of illness. To try and put some figures on that to help you appreciate the weight and the scale of the problem, malaria is one of the most important diseases spread by mosquitoes in the world. Over 90% of the burden of malaria happens in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the deaths that occurred due to malaria are in children under the age of 5. The best estimates we have are that in the next few decades, climate change will cause an additional 15 million cases of malaria each year, which will cause 30,000 deaths, additional deaths, most of them in children under 5. What that means is that every day, 50 children under the age of 5 will be dying from malaria due to climate change. And I think this is particularly cruel when you consider that those young children, and in fact most of the people in the places we're talking about, are those being most affected by climate change, including the impacts on health, despite them having contributed least to the problem. Another example is diarrheal disease, which is the #1 killer of children around the world. It has been estimated that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in ambient temperature, the incidence or rate of diarrheal disease will increase by 5%. 5% doesn't sound like much, but when you consider that 1.5 million children die every year from diarrheal disease, 5% sounds like a lot more. Malnutrition is already the cause of half of the deaths that occur every year due to climate change. Most of the deaths due to malnutrition occur in children and occur in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is one of the most important climate change-related impacts on health as we are seeing today and dealing with today in our operational planning in MSF, and many of you involved in the humanitarian space would also be very much concerned with this problem, I'm sure. And we've already had some very powerful statistics shared around the impact of natural disasters. These are responsible for tens of thousands of deaths every year, in addition to the countless more injuries and other impacts. And the increase of natural disasters, including those linked to climate change over the coming decades, should preoccupy us all. Of course, we can't be sitting here talking about planetary health amidst a pandemic without talking about infectious diseases, or other infectious diseases, including those that jump directly from non-human vertebrate species to humans. These infectious diseases are known as zoonoses. They've been responsible for most of the pandemics and plagues throughout human history, including the one that we are experiencing now. Most new infectious diseases come from animals. Most of those are viruses. And one of the most difficult things that we have confronting us as a global society is how to anticipate from where the next infectious disease threat, the next pandemic pathogen, will come. This is a very complex science, but the question of the next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. And there are many other types of planetary health-related problems, health problems for human populations that are not related or not related as directly to climate change. Things like mining, environmental degradation, deforestation. Of course, ultimately, you can link many of these factors to climate change and the driving forces around it. But the health impacts of these types of phenomena are much less poorly understood because they've been relatively neglected when compared to the health impacts of climate change alone. So what does this mean for an organisation like MSF? We're grappling with these types of questions at the moment. How can we use this type of information for purposes other than scaring ourselves or motivating ourselves? We're trying to translate these categories, these medical priorities, into concrete actions. So in the case of vector-borne, or such, for example, mosquito-borne diseases, we're working in several countries at the moment, attempting to establish early warning systems for severe malaria epidemics based on meteorological and environmental variables. The idea with this is that we can therefore be better prepared and better able to more precisely plan and implement our activities to, for example, control the mosquito populations and reduce the number of people exposed to the parasite. Waterborne diseases are unsurprisingly best tackled by initiatives that improve water sanitation and hygiene. This is, I think, one of the most fundamental things we need to do as a global community, not just health community, not just humanitarian community. And there's other initiatives that we are working on to try and be more data-driven and informed by evidence in our planning for and response to problems like natural disasters, food and nutrition insecurity crises, emerging infectious disease threats, and other forms of planetary health-related problems. Just to give you a couple examples of what this looks like in the field, forgive me for using that term. Earlier this year, we were involved in a short, sharp intervention in northern Honduras after a double hurricane disaster occurred at the latter stages of the worst dengue fever epidemic in a generation. And so that we learned a lot of lessons from that brief project in terms of how to both support the community's needs in terms of water sanitation, hygiene, and do the vector control that was required to try and minimise the risk of the dengue fever epidemic increasing because of the damage to the health systems due to the hurricanes. And so that's the kind of response we have, small armies of health workers going out to do not just community education, but spraying for mosquitoes. Sorry, this thing has a mind of its own. A similar phenomenon occurred in Mozambique, where I was recently, where they had a double cyclone disaster in late 2019 that caused very significant displacement, many injuries and deaths. And MSF's main role was in distributing chlorine and oral cholera vaccines to prevent the outbreaks of cholera that often accompany natural disasters or follow natural disasters. Cholera being one of the main killers in terms of diarrheal disease. And we are currently, as I'm sure you will not be surprised to learn, planning several new, or needing to open several new projects related to food and nutrition insecurity and malnutrition crises, including in the Sahel, including in Chad, and particularly in Madagascar. So where can we go from here? I mean, these are kind of open and partly rhetorical questions, but as I was just saying to a colleague during the coffee break, there is a paradigm shift that needs to occur, including for organisations like MSF, moving away from the way we have always done things to being more open and humble in terms of the approaches needed in the future. That includes incorporating new sources of data, new types of tools, considering new types of partnerships and approaches, while at the same time respecting the experience that MSF and others have built up over decades of humanitarian work. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and thank you again for the opportunity to be included in this great program.
Thank you very much, Lachlan. Now it's time to listen to the presentation of our second speaker, Dr. Parveen Ali, who is a senior policy advisor at the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva and currently heads the Global Compact on Refugees Coordination Team. She's been working in the field of refugee and human rights protection since 1993 in various locations in the Middle East, Africa, and the United States, previously with NGOs and later with the UNHCR. She holds a PhD in law from the LSE and is a national of the United States of America. Parveen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today to speak a little bit about the Global Compact on Refugees. I think it actually follows on very nicely from the discussion that the presentation we just heard, because it does offer something new for us in terms of a blueprint for how we can work together differently and more effectively and in a more concerted way to address significant challenges related to displacement and drivers of displacement, such as climate change and other health emergencies as well. The Global Compact on Refugees, as you may be aware, was affirmed in 2018, and it came out of a process of consultation and discussion that really started in 2016, when states were really grappling with how to address the crisis of displacement that they were seeing across the Mediterranean and Andaman Seas that started in 2015 or escalated in 2015. And really, I think out of an increasing recognition that the way that we've been responding to refugee situations has not been sufficient to meet the needs either of the refugees or of the host countries who generously host them within their communities as part of settlements in camps and in cities, but often are facing a lot of their own challenges around development and the support they need in order to do so sufficiently. So in 2016, the international community came together to adopt the New York Declaration. And as a part of this declaration on refugees and migrants, UNHCR was tasked with developing the Global Compact on Refugees. We developed this in consultation with states and a number of different stakeholder groups to really set out almost a toolbox or a framework for how we can more equitably and predictably share the responsibility for refugees. What we know right now is that the vast majority of refugees are hosted in developing countries and low and middle income countries that are facing many of their own challenges. And we need to find ways to ensure that they get the support they need to ensure that refugees can be included and protected. So the Global Compact sets out a blueprint for governments, international organizations, development actors, and others to come together in a whole of society approach, which is a new form of governance, if I could suggest that, to ensure that refugees can really lead productive lives and that host countries get the support they need. And these efforts really can support inclusive approaches in refugee hosting areas through strengthened development cooperation that really works to ensure that refugees can be included in national systems and that the development cooperation in these areas can benefit both refugees and host communities alike. The Global Compact is also very much linked to the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and it links forced displacement with those goals. And it envisions that working with the UN system, governments, and partners, we can include refugees in our planning, in our policies, and other programs that are really aimed at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, this whole of society approach that's at the heart of the GCR, where it really identifies entry points for so many different stakeholder groups. There are more than 15 stakeholder groups listed in the compact for participating in refugee responses, is also very much in line with the Secretary General's recently announced common agenda, because it contains a number of arrangements and tools for really mobilizing these different stakeholder groups through this reinvigorated form of multilateralism. It also provides avenues for strengthening sustainable funding through much more of an opportunity for the engagement of development actors in the private sector. And it also contains a very important peace-building element, ensuring that people are able to return and rebuild their countries in safety and dignity, and to prevent future conflicts. One of the key arrangements for facilitating all of this engagement and this new approach to refugee situations that's envisioned in the Global Compact is a Global Refugee Forum that would be convened at the ministerial level every 4 years. We had the first Global Refugee Forum in 2019, 1 year after the Global Compact was affirmed. And at that forum, and since that time, we had states and other actors coming together to announce more than almost 1,600 pledges now of financial, technical, material, and policy support for refugee hosting countries. We saw many, many pledges made by important large refugee hosting countries towards greater inclusion and protection of refugees in their national systems. And we've been working very closely with a number of donors and other partners to think about how they can bring the pledges of support that they announced at that forum together with the pledges of policy and towards policy commitments of inclusion and protection to really support their implementation in major host countries. So we call this a process of matching pledges in terms of bringing them together and helping them to amplify each other. But of course, this took place in December 2019, and I don't think anyone foresaw at that point that we would be challenged at the level we were with the COVID-19 pandemic. And a number of states and other actors really were challenged, of course, in implementing a lot of the commitments they made at the forum. But many also rose to the occasion and saw it as an opportunity to think about how they could accelerate the commitments they made, really mobilize and use the Global Compact as an important tool in addressing the pandemic response and strengthening it for refugees and host communities. So in spite of the many challenges around the pandemic, we did see some notable progress in the implementation of the pledges and commitments that were announced. We've received updates on more than half of them. About 3/4 of them have been reported as being in progress towards implementation. Many have been adapted to support the response. So we find this quite a promising move. Maybe just to highlight a few areas where we have seen some good progress since the affirmation of the Global Compact. I think in the area of burden and responsibility sharing for host countries and communities, we've seen that there's been progress on financing for refugee situations. The OECD just released a couple of days ago the report from the Survey on Financing for Refugee Situations, which shows that the official development assistance for refugee hosting countries has increased incrementally over time since the time of the New York Declaration. We don't know yet how this will have been affected by the pandemic, but we have preliminary indications that the official development assistance continued. So this is I think, a good sign that there's continued engagement. But of course, we have to look at that against the backdrop of the growing needs. The fact that still the majority of official development assistance actually goes towards short-term humanitarian responses, so we still need more development actor engagement. But there I think is good progress that we can build on and amplify as we look ahead. We've also seen that it's really important, and we saw this with the pandemic, to include refugees in national responses, health responses, but also in education and livelihoods. A number of countries stepped forward to do precisely this, and we've been working with donors and other actors to identify financing mechanisms to support this. This is obviously a key area where burden and responsibility sharing needs to be stepped up, and we've been working very closely with them on this. We also saw in the context of COVID an increase in looking at different forms of connected education so that refugees in camps or in remote areas can access education. But we need much more of an investment, particularly in secondary and tertiary education for refugees. We also saw that there were more than 28 countries that announced a legal framework towards economic inclusion of refugees, and there's a sizable number of countries now that provide in law the ability for refugees to access the labor market. However, the challenge, of course, particularly in the context of pandemic, is how this translates in practice. We need much more of a focus on the development of administrative regulations and implementing mechanisms to make this law a reality for many refugees. Maybe just to mention also in the area of solutions, which is a very strong feature of the Global Compact, we saw that there has been some progress in some areas around, for example, Somalia's adoption of a national durable solutions strategy, which really is looking at a comprehensive approach to solutions. But there were a lot of challenges, particularly with the pandemic and the border closures and restrictions that resulted with resettlement and giving refugees access to complementary pathways such as labor mobility schemes and other programs. So this is something that we very much need to amplify looking ahead. We also, I think a really notable thing about the Global Compact, which I mentioned before, was that it does envision a role for many different stakeholder groups. And we've seen since the affirmation of the Global Compact that parliamentarians and parliamentary networks have become much more engaged in refugee responses. We have a multi-religious council of leaders that's really taking the lead on global advocacy messages and messaging around peace building, reconciliation, conflict prevention. We've had sports organizations coming forward and working more closely with refugees to facilitate integration and inclusion. And most critically, we've had refugees themselves and refugees who lead their own NGOs really at the heart of this entire effort. We had a very, very large contingent of refugees participating in the first Global Refugee Forum in 2019, and our engagement and consultation with them has continued. And they're very much lending their expertise to how we can take this forward, and their commitments have been reflected in a number of communications and projects and global processes that we've been engaged in. I think another notable thing, in addition to the Global Refugee Forum, which had a lot of visibility, there have also been a number of initiatives within the Global Compact that were really envisioned to facilitate more responsibility sharing. Notably among those, I would mention that we have these regional support platforms that are developed primarily with states, but also some other actors, such as development actors, to really facilitate political mobilization, support, and engagement in refugee situations. And we have them set up now for the Afghan refugee situation. They address situations in the Eastern Horn of Africa, as well as Mexico and Central America. And these are very good tools for not only kind of keeping up the momentum and the engagement of donors, but really thinking strategically about how the mobilization of resources can support solutions and inclusion of refugees in these situations. We formed also a global academic interdisciplinary network, which maybe some participants here are part of, which is hosted out of the University of Essex and really focuses on the engagement of academics around the implementation of the approaches envisioned in the Global Compact, also supporting refugee scholars. And then we also have an asylum capacity support group. And this is quite an interesting mechanism where host countries that are really facing challenges with their asylum systems are coming forward with requests for support to strengthen their systems through financial support or technical capacity. And we've been matching them with donors through this mechanism to really work on different ways to strengthen their asylum systems, but also to kind of demonstrate responsibility, sharing, and action, and how this principle at the heart of the Global Compact can really make a difference. So just looking ahead now, the Global Compact, is a toolbox. It's a blueprint for how we can do things differently, hopefully more effectively. It provides entry points for a lot of different stakeholders, but it's something that we need to continue to apply and be prepared to apply in new challenges that confront us, not only with the pandemic, but also, for example, around climate action and continued or persistent conflicts that we're facing. So the Global Compact envisions that not only is there a global refugee forum that will be held every 4 years, but in between, every 2 years in between each forum, there is what is called a high-level officials meeting. And this is really an opportunity to take stock of progress towards the objectives of the compact, increasing support for host countries, refugee self-reliance, access to solutions, to really see how far we've come. We'll be launching next Tuesday an indicator report for the Global Compact on Refugees, and this will give us the beginnings of an evidence base to really make that assessment. And then in December, we'll be having a meeting with states and other stakeholders to really reflect on what we've learned from the report, what we've learned from implementing the many pledges and the initiatives over the past couple of years, and where we need to focus on next. And we're very much hoping that at the high-level officials meeting, that the key recommendations coming out of that meeting will really serve as the basis for strategically identifying how we're going to work towards the next Global Refugee Forum in 2023, and think about the kinds of partnerships that we need, the kinds of pledges we want to cultivate, the initiatives and how to amplify them, how to bring more donors and other actors to the table to support beyond the kind of traditional top 20 that feature very prominently in many of these conversations. So we are really, we're looking forward to this event in December, because we think this will really be an opportunity to have a substantive conversation around some of these questions, and will help to chart the way forward as we look ahead. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Parveen. So now it's time to listen to the presentation of Héloïse Ruodel, who is a senior technical specialist on crisis migration at the International Labour Organization Migration Branch. The title of her presentation will be "The Refugees' Access to Decent Work in a Pandemic Context and Toward a Human-Centered Recovery." So she will be online. Let's hope that...
I am online. Can
good.
You hear me?
Welcome, Héloïse. Welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. And apologies for not being in person with you for this important occasion. Also a pleasure to intervene straight after Parveen Ali, as the ILO is one of the, as she mentioned, very many stakeholder organizations and other stakeholders who are supporting the implementation of the compact and taking part in the Global Refugee Forum. So yes, about refugees' access to decent work in pandemic context, also hopefully moving towards a human-centered recovery. So before I touch on the impact of the COVID, just a quick word on ILO's role to support economic inclusion of refugees. I mean, usually when we think of refugee, UNHCR comes to mind naturally first, but the ILO has engaged in labor aspects of refugees' response since its inception in 1919, over 100 years ago. It was actively involved in getting refugees into jobs and protecting them from exploitation in the aftermath of World War I. And its constitutions it really refers to the protection of the interest of workers when employed in country other than their own, so obviously covering migrants as well as refugees. ILO's mandate is really to promote a decent work approach. So this relates to provision of work and income opportunities, but also very much to workplace rights, recognitions of equality, and social dialogue. This is a humanitarian conference, but I think it's important to talk And I will present ILO's approach and vision in a way, as it sees decent work really bridging the humanitarian and development divide that we can sometimes still observe, although I think there's been a lot of efforts to go beyond that. And also we see decent work as being key to fostering peace. So the interesting entry point, but the humanitarian development nexus is that refugees are no longer seen as mere recipients of long-term humanitarian aid, but potential producers, consumers, and entrepreneurs. And decent work really plays a key role to move refugees towards self-reliance. And this is, as Praveen reminded us, also a key objective of the compact. And the nexus is really about complementarity and coherence between the short-term emergency assistance, which doesn't by all means disappear, but longer-term sustainable livelihood approach. So it's really about mitigating socioeconomic impact on host countries and community to ease social tension through inclusive approach to facilitate positive impact on labor markets. And it implies the early intervention of development actors, notably. The ILO is a normative organization, so it really very much relies on international labor standards. But in recent years, around the time of the New York Declaration, it developed an important instrument. It's called the Guiding Principles on the Access of Refugees and Other Forcibly Displaced Persons to the Labor Market. It's a non-binding instrument, which makes it somewhat flexible. It's also short, and it's rounded on international labor standard, and it really aims to address the need for more equitable responsibility sharing with countries impacted, to strengthen labor market institutions and programs, and to support, assist states in considering the access of these populations to the labor markets, but really balancing it with the needs and expectations of their own citizens. The following year was adopted another very important instrument. This time it's a recommendation on employment and decent work for peace and resilience. It's broader. It has a specific chapter that focuses on refugees and returnees. And it's the one ILO labor standard for ILO's constituents to address employment and other world of work issues in crisis situations arising both from conflict and disasters. And it proved to be a useful instrument now as we're facing COVID-19, but also in relation to the other crises we've evoked throughout the conference, including climate change and related displacements. So it's therefore a landmark instrument for dealing with situations that are at the crossroads of humanitarian peace building, disaster response, and development initiatives. I will talk about the specific impact of COVID, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of the pre-existing context when it comes to access to labor markets for refugees. As protracted conflicts, fragility, and the lack of solutions increase the duration of displacement, obviously finding employment is essential. And access to livelihood and decent work is central to the new intervention framework that we've discussed in the previous presentation. And I think it's also important to realize that to not always think about the challenges, but also think that employment really brings economic benefits, obviously to the displaced populations, but to the country of destinations and the countries of origin. And yet there's still too often this mismatch between the objective realities and the subjective opinions that are often manipulated. A couple of challenges, some around the labor, related specifically to the labor market. The low employment rates, restricted markets are sometimes unable to absorb the rapid and unpredictable rise of labor supply. This drives down wages. It can cause competitions between hosts, migrants, and refugees over resources, and can cause potential tension. an important challenge is the lack of formal employment. There is a concentration of refugees, but also of migrant workers in informal economy, and that increases the risk of exploitation, abuses, and with informality, there's also a lack of social protection coverage and a risk to have recourse to negative coping mechanism. Obviously, some key legislative and policy challenges around the right to work, but also other socioeconomic rights to access education, to be able to move and live in areas where jobs are found. Challenges related to skills and qualifications. Refugees may lack skills and qualifications that are relevant to the host country's labor markets, or they may have those skills, but they lack access to skills and qualification recognition mechanism, and have also limited access to training opportunities. I think it's important to talk about gender and women and the fact that they are at risk of multiple layers of discriminations linked to their gender, their nationality, their status. And again, this has a negative impact: lower wages, less access to jobs, to training. A number of important practical constraints, many around the administrative hurdle to obtain work permit, to register for social security, but some are linked to to refugees themselves. Think of Syrian refugees who have moved to Turkey, the country hosting the largest number of refugees worldwide. Language barrier has been and continue to be an important issue. My colleague Michelle Layton yesterday touched upon the wider impact of COVID, so I won't expand on this, but just to highlight again that the job recovery is not, stalled and is not, it's not going in the direction or as fast as we were hoping. And she highlighted also the great divergence between developed and developing countries, and this very much relate to the slow rollout of vaccination and of fiscal stimulus in developing countries. But looking at the specific impact of COVID on refugees workers, the pandemic has exacerbated, if you want, existing vulnerabilities. This was also, I think, highlighted earlier this morning by the Assistant High Commissioner. So refugees were already earning less than nationals prior to the crisis because they're mainly in the informal economy. But with COVID, they've experienced greater loss of income and were amongst the first to be laid off, particularly women. This increased food insecurity, put continuous education of children at risk, had an impact on remittances. And small and micro enterprises that are key sources of livelihood for refugees have been the most affected. Limited access to social protection has been really highlighted during the crisis. I mean, it was the case before, as I said earlier, but the lockdown situations, they've limited further, or they have interrupted social protection coverage. It was also difficult for these populations to apply protection measures because of the informal context and occupations where they're concentrated, had less access to personal protective equipment, to preventive safety and health measures, information. We've seen a really declining working conditions and the increase of protection risk, increase generally, but also specifically for refugee population of gender-based violence. Child labor was also mentioned earlier this morning, and it's indeed been proven that children as refugees, migrants and IDPs, as well as children living in places affected by crisis or disaster, have been more affected by child labor with the COVID. And this really puts social cohesion at risk. It can exacerbate grievances, mistrust, discrimination and xenophobia, and lead to potential conflict and undermine development, peace, and social cohesion. So to address the challenges faced by refugees and others. The ILO has first really tried to monitor regularly through rapid assessment tools the impact of COVID on various countries, various sectors and groups. Those are just some examples of countries where these assessments were conducted. There was also a specific policy brief on protecting the right of work of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons. We've developed contingency planning and mitigation strategies to support the inclusion of displaced populations in the COVID-19 response and recovery processes. And what has been important is to try to counter this vulnerability to job losses and ensure their social protection coverage of refugees, but also returnees and host communities. And this really to try to support employers retain their workers. And there are some interesting positive examples, notably from Turkey. Obviously, the ILO is not doing this alone, and there's been collaboration with other UN agencies, ILO's constituents, to respond to the impact. Number of important joint guidance, operational approaches to response to the crisis. Here you have some example of really, things related to work conditions. And the ILO has also reoriented its development cooperation activities in many parts of the world. And we will continue to support governments in their effort to include refugees, migrants, displaced persons in the COVID response, and this through advocacy and social dialogue, which is an essential component. We've made a number of key recommendations, and I think it's important to highlight that a number of countries have made lots of efforts towards this inclusion. But yeah, some of the recommendations have been and remain to recognize migrants and refugees' positive contributions to economic and social recovery. Some have been really in sectors that were and still are at the forefront of the COVID-19 response. Ensure that vulnerable workers have regular status, do not fall into irregular status. Ensure fair wages, decent work, and access to justice. Extend access to health services and social protection to all workers, including refugees. Protect all workers in the workplace through inclusive and sustainable recovery. Provide accessible information on workplace safety, health measures. Take measures to counter discrimination. Develop policies based on, as I said earlier, social dialogue, full involvement of employer and worker organizations. And to finish, the ILO International Labour Conference has adopted a global call to action, really outlining measures to create this human-centered recovery from the pandemic and really avoid the long-term scarring of economies and society. And this implies measures taken by national governments, employers, trade unions, but also very much implies international cooperation and the role of multilateral institutions in increasing the level and coherence of their support for this human-centered pandemic recovery strategy. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Eloise, and apologies because I haven't read to the audience your bio note, but anyway, you hold a Master of Economic and Social Studies and International Policy from Aberystwyth University in Wales. I just like the way the pronunciation is. Very difficult to pronounce this Welsh prestigious university. And a Master in Public Law from the Faculty of Law and Political Science of Rennes in France. But first of all, you have over 20 years of experience on humanitarian assistance and protection activities, including in fragile and post-conflict context. Having said that, I would like to open to questions. Please identify yourselves and state your affiliation, if any. Ask questions, or if you have a comment, it has to be succinct. Thank you very much. Yes, Susanne.
Okay. I'm Susan Peters, Webster University. My question is to you, Mr. McVeer, from MSF. In your talk, actually, it was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Very inspiring. All what you do and what expands the world. My question is, you mentioned at the end of your talk that because of that new concept of planetary health and because of climate change, you need now to new data and to new approaches and so on. And I asked myself, such an effective organization like MSF, so effective and competent. So what do you have to look now at, what do you have to include now in your analysis, which you didn't include before? So just what has changed here in your approach to understand where you have to get active or whatever? So I don't know whether it's clear.
Thanks for your question. I think the best response I can offer is perhaps illustrated by an example. And we've been talking a lot this morning about natural disasters. So natural disasters represent a significant proportion of the humanitarian emergencies to which MSF responds. However, MSF's role in response to natural disasters is not as clear as one may think intuitively. Usually the first actors on the ground in the hours and days following a disaster are either the country's own actors, the Ministry of Health, National Disaster Management Agency, military or emergency medical teams. And organisations like MSF, even though we're relatively agile and there's a part of our organisation that is dedicated to that kind of work, it still takes a few days to get there normally. And so what we have found in some recent internal evaluations of our own effectiveness in disaster response is that basically we're not as effective as we would like to be. And so that begs the question, how can we be more effective? And then that leads to a discussion about, well, how can we be more informed? And that's where that application of data and tools and partnerships comes into it. And my role, the beautiful, complex, terrible, challenging role that I have to try and help the organisation move forward a little bit by capturing that kind of information. So there's two things that we're looking at specifically in that context at the moment. One is long-range forecasting for different types of particularly hydrometeorological disasters, because for something like cyclones, while there are phenomenon like ENSO cycles, and there are sort of probabilities or risks of different types of extreme weather events like cyclones occurring, usually by the time a cyclone or hurricane or typhoon forms, you're talking hours to days at best in terms of the time that you have to before the impact. Whereas there's emerging science that can move those timelines out to more like weeks at least, if not months, certainly seasons. And an organisation like MSF is not using that type of information yet. And I think we really should be. And then, so that's kind of in the anticipation of the disaster itself. Then in terms of the impact of the disaster, we are sort of accustomed to basically doing what we've always done. A big storm hits, then we say, okay, well, we need a kit for this and a kit for that, and off we go. There are tools available to more precisely estimate the different types of injury patterns and death patterns, unfortunately, that can occur depending on the type of disaster, the type of geographic location, the type of population setting, the level of economic development, the health system capacity, these kind of things. So you could sum it up by saying taking a more data-driven approach to disasters rather than just the roll the sleeves up and let's go attitude that MSF has historically had.
Thank you. Other questions over there?
Thank you very much. My name is Abdulaziz Khan, and I am an IR student at Webster University, Geneva. Panelist Perveen Ali, she said that we need to make sure that they get the help they need, referring to developing countries hosting refugees. So a statement arises that if there is a legal framework that compels or in essence requires those in power or quote-unquote developed countries to help those in need irrespective of the fact that they may be providing aid without a legal framework, there would be a more robust and meaningful impact on the process and the system. So I would like to hear the thoughts of all the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that statement. I think actually you're speaking exactly to what they were hoping to achieve with the Global Compact, because there's this recognition that almost 90% of refugees in the world are hosted in countries that are low or middle income. These countries host them in a variety of places. The vast majority are hosted in cities. There's a bit of, I think, a misperception that most refugees are in camps. That's actually not the case. And these countries are doing a lot to try to support and include refugees to the best of their abilities. But there is a recognition that a lot more support was needed in order to be able to achieve that. And that it means, and this is where the idea of burden and responsibility sharing that's at the heart of the Global Compact really developed. And it was in a recognition that there was much more sharing of responsibility needed to ensure that host countries could actually achieve this. There's always been support for host countries, but it's often been ad hoc, it's been short-term, it hasn't been systematic, and there was a call for something that was much more predictable and sustainable over the longer term. So this was really I think the ambition and the vision behind the Global Compact. But as we were developing the compact and consulting on it, the nature of what that mechanism would look like, or what that kind of arrangement would look like, was it was at the heart of a very interesting, I think, discussion between hosting and donor countries in particular, as well as a number of actors. And it was agreed in the end that the Global Compact would, rather than being kind of a traditional standard-setting legal instrument, it would be much more practical, because the need for more international cooperation is already enshrined in the 1951 Refugee Convention. That obligation is there, but we needed something very practical to give that more effect and to give that meaning. And that was really the idea behind the compact and the arrangements that it envisioned. So the Global Refugee Forum that meets every 4 years to really focus on, galvanizing commitments towards solutions, self-reliance, and support for host countries, really is the main mechanism that's envisioned by the compact to facilitate this kind of responsibility sharing. But these other ones that I mentioned, such as the regional support platforms, or the asylum capacity group, or the academic network, these are different opportunities for stakeholders to come together and also participate in sharing that responsibility through the kinds of contributions that they can make. So that was ultimately, those arrangements were the practical tools to give effect to that responsibility.
Yes.
John Munz, I'm the Executive Director of TFF. I have a question going towards Dr. McIver's point. It sounds like what you're talking about in your last response that you had is data aggregation and deep data analysis. Has there been an effort by the international aid community to create a centralized repository for all of their field data so that the entire community can have access through a big data solution like Netezza Hadoop to process real-time information as is needed to direct their operations?
I should be clear about the fact that I'm not an expert in disaster science or disaster response. I'm just trying to sort of nudge MSF in the right direction with this. There are certainly platforms of information sharing. There's one that's used by many governments and emergency medical teams that provides real-time, close to real-time information about different types of disasters, both natural disasters and conflict and other types of anthropogenic disasters, and also what is happening in terms of response, because obviously one of the great challenges and criticisms in the past has been poor coordination. Actors don't tend to like to play nice together in these situations. And often there's the ridiculous situation of having too many actors in the one place and overwhelming the system. Just absurd. Anyway, so there's platforms like that do exist. In terms of how rich such platforms are with respect to their, for example, their predictive power, I don't know, but that would be a really useful tool to have available for an organisation like MSF. And then I can say quite transparently that MSF contributes very little to such databases. So it's a bit of a sort of uneven contribution that we are asking for and offering with that. So again, I think this is all the way we should be advancing. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer to your question. Maybe it gives you a little bit of a shape of the thing.
Another couple of questions. Yes?
I have another question for panelist Dr. McIver. So normally, whenever there's a problem, if we don't understand the problem, it's difficult to find a solution, and we would continue to suffer losses and deficits. So I want to ask if, and since you laid out quite the quantitative data and told us how each and everything is impactful on one another, if there is more awareness among the people, do you think that the MSF or the ILO will achieve their cause more efficiently? Which links to the data and communication question two. So if you can comment on that.
I'm not sure I 100% understand what's at the heart of your question. Do you mind just clarifying your point for me, please?
So basically what I mean to say is that if the people understand the consequences of whatever is happening and understand the cause of it too, do you think that the mission of the MSF or the ILO, which is to provide aid and help people, would that be more efficient?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Look, I think the most relevant response I can offer to that is really relevant to what's happening in Glasgow at the moment as well. It's around what information does the global society, if there is such a thing as a global society, what information needs to be more widely shared and understood in order for the most rational and useful and beneficial decisions to be made. And I think coming from my perspective, having worked for many, many years on the health impacts of climate change, for example, I know essentially nothing about what ILO does, although I have the greatest respect for their work. But for the health sector at least, what frightens me, what keeps me up at night, what one of our speakers referred to in the first session as the sort of the depressing nature of this work, is how little people understand about these links and these impacts. So the delusion that so much of the world's population lives in, that climate change and its impacts, including on health, are some distant, abstract problem for future generations or other people or poor people or whatever, it is exactly that. It's a delusion. And I think if it was much more widely understood, including on the part of politicians, including on the part of academics, policymakers, that these are current problems that affect many people already, they're just not people who are very visible or very powerful, then that would and should enable such the courage for those decisions to be taken. Again, that's a bit of a vague response, but I hope you can see what I'm getting at with that.
Otto.
I wish we could go on for days and days, because there are so many aspects of these problems that are worth discussing. But I would like to come back to something that was supposed to be in my keynote speech, but of course, you know, time is limited. So let me just add 2 or 3 comments that are relevant to some of the questions that were raised. Number one, there was a time when people were talking about donor fatigue. And then there is asylum fatigue. And now I think we are facing disaster fatigue. That is to say, we are being told, or people are being told, all these terrible things, but then people say, I can't get to my work because I don't have any gas. So you cannot convince somebody who has to get to work that driving a car is bad when he needs gasoline to get to work. So I think some of the academics, but also some of the NGOs, some of the organizations should spend a little bit more systematic time to understand what makes cooperation work and what does not make it work. What you have to do to make the population, not the decision maker, but the population of the so-called rich countries share the problems of the world. How do you get real solidarity? Well, the way is that what is in it for us? Do we get at least some recognition? Or are we just being accused of being the worst of the worst? In Afghanistan, you always hear about what happened with America, America's war. There were 80 countries involved in trying to help Afghanistan out of the worst kind of regime that you can imagine. 80 countries. And those 80 countries were not criminal countries. They were trying to help. The trillions of dollars that were spent there were not all for imperialistic purposes. Now it's all gone. The women, the children, the intellectuals who have to run for cover, that is not because America's war was wrong, it's because we could not get our action in order. So I think if you look up, and I'm going to stop, not going to give another speech. If you look up the word cooperation in international relations textbooks, it has a very, very small place. It's always, there's a qualifier, humanistic cooperation. But the idea how to cooperate internationally is something that most experts think is secondary. How you get recognized for helping somebody gets very little attention. So this is all I wanted to say, and I would like to thank again for Webster having given the opportunity to think about these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Otto Geronimi. So it's time to thank our distinguished speakers. So thank you, Perveen, thank you, Lachlan, thank you, Eloisa, and I will leave the floor to Jupin Gudarzi. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Oreste, for moderating that panel, and I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Lachlan McIver and Perveen Ali and Eloise Roidel for this final, but also very informative panel which left a lot of, provided a lot of food for us. I think many questions were answered in this conference over the 1.5 days. Of course, there are certain questions which were not answered, but maybe that will be the basis somehow in terms of when we meet to discuss, to decide the theme of next year's humanitarian conference. Hopefully we'll have the 27th Annual International Humanitarian Security Conference next year. Maybe that'll, we can shed more light on some of the issues that were discussed here. We'll see how things evolve in the world on different fronts with regard to humanitarian issues, climate change, security issues. All these issues are linked together. I trust those of you who are here, who were here yesterday and today, and also those following online. We've been live streaming this whole event over the past 1.5 days, as we did last year in 2020 for the first time due to the pandemic. We had usually about 70-80% more people following online via live stream, and usually we had about 50 people or more in the conference center. Anyway, as they say, all good things must come to an end, and of course this conference is now coming to an end. I think in terms of the keynote speeches we had on the 2 days from Gilles Carbonnier and Jean-François Riffaut, and this morning Gillian Triggs and Professor Hieronymi, and the 6 panels, the 6 sessions, I think we had great speakers. They made a very valuable contribution. And finally, I wanted to thank everybody who participated in making this conference a reality in terms of preparation, organization, and making sure that it came to fruition. So I would like to thank our events coordinator, Celia Joachim, for everything that she did. Also, our departmental assistants and researcher, Jonathan Windmuller, and also Filip Rodanovic. I would also like to thank the WHA, the Webster Humanitarian Association, our student NGO, Aya Abdullah, Uda Kalix, and all the other students who are, some of them are here, some of them are outside, who've helped over the past 1.5 days. Some of them are not here, they're back on campus elsewhere. And also of course, the management of the CECG, the director, Monsieur Luca Pellandini, and also the IT staff from 4 a.m. So we had 3 speakers today on Zoom, so everything went well, smoothly, without a glitch, so we're very pleased. And also the support we received from the senior management at Webster University itself in terms of our acting director, Ryan Guffey, the support from Oreste. So I have your good luck pad here, so I'll give it back to you. You gave it to me before the conference. And so the department. So thank you very much all. I wish you, as they say here in Geneva in French, bonne continuation today and for the rest of the week until the weekend, and hope to see you all soon. And if we can be of any assistance to you, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us, contact the department head, or Professor Oreste Foppiani, or myself. So we are at your disposal, whether you're international organizations people, NGOs, students, permanent missions, etc., etc. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And this conference, as I said, in addition to being live streamed, I should add, it's recorded, so we will make sure that it's made available on our website, on the internet, and including the recorded session, the recorded presentation yesterday, which we were not unable to show, by Professor Robert Kolb of the University of Geneva. So, so the recording and his talk will be uploaded, so you can watch it, and those of you who missed any of the sessions or whatever, because I think we had outstanding presentations, very high quality, and the session 6 right now was no exception. So thank you very much, and have a good day.